Welcome to Midnight History, where the forgotten truths of the past come to life. Kale lifts a vial of pale blue liquid. His eyes are calm, almost resigned. Around him are glass tubes, curling smoke, and the whispering hiss of fire. Introducing the role of the poison tester, a dangerous and thankless job, living in the shadows of alchemists, risking death for someone else's pursuit of greatness. Introducing Kale. From an orphan street boy to the assistant of famed alchemist Varen, Kale begins by sweeping floors and ends up swallowing the unknown. His body becomes an experiment. His life becomes a risk. Yet in the cracks between near death and discovery, something extraordinary begins to unfold. Guiding question: can someone with no status, no power, leave a mark on the history of alchemy through blood, pain, and persistence? Once again, if you like this video, don't forget to like and subscribe so we have more motivation to produce better quality products. Kale was the son of a poor leather worker, a man whose hands were always stained, whose breath always reeked of tanning acid and rot. The leather trade in the lower quarter of Velhast was not just brutal, it was poisonous. The pits used to soak hides were filled with caustic lime, crushed bark, and fetid animal remains, creating a permanent stench that clung to the lungs and made the air seem thick, heavy. His father, like many in the trade, aged quickly. His skin cracked from constant chemical exposure, his eyes grew dull, and his voice, once full of bitter laughter, was reduced to a rasping cough. His mother had died a few years before, leaving Kale to grow up watching his father deteriorate slowly and pitifully, while scraping coins from a trade that offered neither dignity nor safety. When his father finally succumbed to a mixture of lung rot and alcohol, barely mourned, barely noticed, Kale was left to wander the alleys of Velhast alone, just 10 years old and already more shadowed than a child. Scavenging became survival. While other orphans begged, Kale learned to watch the alchemist's quarter, where even the garbage could be valuable if you had the stomach for it. Every evening, when the final bells rang and apprentices shuttered the thick, smoky windows of their masters' laboratories, Kale prowled the refuse heaps. Broken glass, rusting clamps, shards of quartz lenses, failed tinctures, and charred pages of formulae. These were his currency. He'd barter them in the back rooms of apothecaries and among the junk stalls at the bone market. The waste was dangerous. A single misstep could mean a burn that went through skin to bone, or fumes that made the world twist and dance before darkness took over. But Kale understood risk. Risk, in his world, was not something to avoid. It was something to master. Others feared the gleaming green pools that hissed in gutters. He learned to see the color, smell the residue, and know what had been used for. He learned to survive it. One afternoon, the sky sickly with smoke and the cobblestones damp with some unknown discharge, Kale noticed something wrong outside the back door of a laboratory he knew well. This place, belonging to Master Varen, one of the most notoriously secretive alchemists in Velhast, was always locked, always guarded. His assistants wore protective veils and rarely spoke in the streets. But today, a young man lay slumped beside the refuse chute, twitching faintly, his lips blue and flecked with foam. Kale knew the signs instantly: inhalation poisoning. The boy had likely opened a fuming crucible or botched the handling of volatile salts. Without hesitation, Kale ripped a rag from his shirt, soaked in the brine from a nearby trough, and clamped it over the boy's nose. He turned the apprentice on his side, pressed hard against the chest, and waited as the spasms gradually slowed. There was no heroism in his actions. It was instinct practicality. He didn't want to watch someone die. There was nothing noble about it. He didn't see the eyes watching him from the shadows above. Master Varen had been observing, silent as always, from the small circular window high in the wall. When the apprentice was recovered and the story was told, how a gutter rat had saved his life, the master summoned Kale. No words were exchanged at first. The boy was brought into the laboratory's lowest level, where the walls were slick with years of soot and every surface seemed coated in the remnants of failed experiments. Varen, gaunt and pale with eyes like old glass, simply pointed at a stained cloth and motioned for Kale to clean. From that moment, his role was decided, not as a student, not as an apprentice, a cleaner, a body to scrub away ash and bile, a boy whose silence and resilience had earned him a place in the heart of danger. And for Kale, this was enough for now. In the months that followed, Kale adapted to the rhythms of the laboratory, like a feral creature tamed just enough not to bite. He awoke before dawn to sweep the hallways, collect alchemical refuse, and scrub the soot-coated walls of the furnace chamber until his fingers bled. The laboratory itself was unlike any place he had ever known. Towering racks of glass were suspended like crystal organs, books bound in dried reptile skin, and jars of preserved horrors that whispered when the room was quiet. Varen had strict rules. Never speak unless addressed, never touch without gloves, and never, ever ask questions. The other assistants treated Kale with a mix of disdain and fear. He was a cleaner, a nothing, but Varen noticed everything. It began with small tests. The master would leave vials half full of unidentified liquid for Kale to clean, watching through mirror panels to see if the boy recognized danger. Once, Kale picked up a flask coated in fine green residue and immediately dunked it in vinegar before scrubbing, neutralizing a base compound that could have scarred his hands permanently. Another time, he instinctively opened a windowsill vent when he detected an almond-like smell from spilled powder, saving himself an entire floor from cyanide fumes. Varen said nothing, but the vials became more frequent. And then came the moment that would change everything. One evening, after a day thick with ash and failed experiments, Varen called Kale into the upper chamber, a room rarely entered by any but the most senior apprentices. The space was silent, cold, and smelled faintly of iron and rot. On a black table stood a single vial of pale blue liquid. Varen gestured to it, then to Kale. The message was simple, unspoken. Drink. Kale hesitated for only a moment. There was no fear left in him, only calculation. If Varen wanted him dead, there were 100 easier ways. So he lifted the vial and swallowed. Pain bloomed in his stomach like fire, cold, sharp, and immediate. He collapsed to the floor, shaking, sweat pooling under his arms. But he lived, and the next morning, he was not dismissed. He was given a cot in the back room, near the fire, and a new name among the staff, Poison Tester. From then on, Kale's purpose shifted. He was still cleaner, still servant, but he was now also the master's human crucible, where others tested on rats. Kale was given tinctures, serums, and volatile compounds, often with no explanation, no preparation, no antidote. Some made him vomit for days. Others clouded his thoughts, made his skin crawl with unseen insects. One turned his vision yellow for a week. He began to understand the cruelty of the position he held. Not just a physical toll, but the psychological weight of being expendable. Varen never offered thanks, only notes in his ledger. Kale was not a boy. He was a data point, a constant, silent answer to alchemical questions too dangerous for the elite to ask themselves. But something else happened in that cold laboratory between the waves of pain and hallucination. Kale learned. He observed everything. The way Varen held his flask when measuring mercury, the specific rhythm of heating and cooling certain minerals, the quiet muttering of ancient formulas in dead languages. He was not taught. He absorbed. And what he could not understand, he memorized. Symbols etched into the floor, recipes half-burned, the sequence of symbols on Varen's personal sigils. His mind, battered and scarred by poison, became sharper than any of the master's apprentices. Over time, the other assistants began to fear him more openly. They watched the way Kale walked through the laboratory like he belonged there. They whisper about the times he didn't flinch when fire exploded from a copper basin, or when acid burned through his boot, and he didn't scream. He was something different now, not quite a servant, not quite a man, something shaped by pain, forged in silence. Varen trusted him enough to test unstable compounds that even senior staff refused to approach. And though he still slept on a thin cot by the furnace, Kale had begun to feel something dangerous, purpose. Yet this life, this miserable alchemy-tainted life, had left its mark. Kale's hair thinned prematurely. His skin took on a sickly hue, and his hands trembled when still, but his eyes remained sharp, calculating. And sometimes, when he stared too long at the other apprentices, they looked away, uncomfortable under the gaze of someone who had swallowed death and survived. There was no kindness left in Kale, no softness. The world had scraped it out of him with acid and flame. He did not dream. He did not weep. He endured, And in that endurance, he began to understand a terrifying truth. History remembers only the ones who leave a mark. Even if that mark is made in blood, he began to collect things. Small things, discarded notes, shards of failed experiments, unlabeled vials. He kept them under his cot in a rusted box, organizing them with precision. No one noticed, or perhaps they did, and no one cared enough to ask. Cale had become part of the laboratory structure, a fixture like the fire or the soot. But within him, something was growing. Not hope, not rebellion. Something quieter, a hunger, not for freedom. He had no illusions about escaping Varen's grip, but for knowledge, for mastery. He began to imagine a different kind of history, one not written by noble-born scholars in university towers, one written in scars, in pain, in chemicals and madness, a history where the nameless were not forgotten because they forced the world to remember. Cale, the boy who had once scavenged glass shards for food, was gone. In his place stood something else, quieter, crueler, more deliberate. He had learned not to flinch at suffering, not to question cruelty. And in that crucible of quiet brutality, something in him began to calcify. What began as a child's instinct to survive had become something sharper. Cale was no longer surviving. He was planning, watching, learning, waiting, and all the while, the laboratory churned on. Smoke in the halls, screams in the night, bottles that glowed when the lights went out. Varen continued his work, unaware, or perhaps entirely aware, of the thing he had created. A boy shaped by poisons, a shadow given purpose, a cleaner no longer content to clean. This was Cale's life before the laboratory became his prison and his proving ground, before the experiments would push the limits of human endurance, before the poisons would blur into something else entirely, before his name would vanish in the records, but his legacy would burn into alchemical history like a stain that would never come out. In the long, uneventful annals of alchemical experimentation, the records are full of forgotten names, assistants, apprentices, and human vessels who faded into anonymity after serving as nothing more than footnotes beneath more prominent discoveries. Yet among the more unsettling accounts preserved in the internal logs of the Velhast Alchemical Consortium is the tale of the 7-day coma, a clinical, disturbingly indifferent name for a period of bodily paralysis, neurological decay, and metaphysical disturbance that befell one of Master Varen's least known but most frequently used poison testers. His name, of course, was Cale, a name scrawled in red ink on dosage logs, annotated without emotion in daily ledgers, and occasionally underlined when symptoms were particularly interesting. It was during this phase of his service, after nearly 3 years of ingesting experimental compounds, that Cale's usefulness was stretched to its outer limit. The compound in question had been theorized, never tested, never measured with precision, during one of Varen's particularly unhinged creative streaks. It involved the sap of the so-called living root, a rare and extremely volatile botanical specimen capable of minor autonomous motion, coupled with an iron-based solvent historically used to erode enchanted metals. On their own, both substances were dangerous. The living root was known to cause slow vascular seizures when inhaled, and the metal solvent, a thick black liquid with a bitter sulfuric smell, could cause internal hemorrhaging if even a drop reached the digestive tract. But Varen, ever consumed by his theories about sentient matter and neurological transmutation, was not interested in their separate effects. He wished to understand what happened when two opposing forces, life and decay, root and rust, merged into a singular solution. It was, in his mind, a test of philosophical elegance. In practice, it was a cold-blooded gamble. And so the compound was prepared. 7 drops of sap filtered through charred bone into 1 ounce of solvent, heated just below boiling in a copper flask, then chilled in salt water until the color turned from green to gray. He handed it to Cale without a word. By then, there was no ceremony, no explanations, just a cold glass vial passed like bread at a miser's table. Cale looked at the mixture, noting the faint shimmer at its center, the way it pulsed slightly, as though resisting containment. His hand didn't tremble. They never did anymore. He drank it in a single motion, the way someone accepts a beating they've grown accustomed to. The taste was immediate and wrong. sharp like rusted nails, but layered with something green, raw, and crawling. For a few minutes, Cale felt nothing at all. He went back to scrubbing the copper basin in the corner, half listening to the hiss of another failed batch burning in the crucible behind him. Then the world tilted sideways. The first symptom was auditory, a deep, echoing ring inside his head, like hearing a cathedral bell underwater. Then came the vertigo. Cale gripped the edge of the basin, but the metal felt like it was dissolving under his fingertips. The smell of the air shifted, turned foul and wet, and suddenly nothing made sense. He collapsed, limbs twitching erratically, pupils dilating to an unnatural width. His right arm convulsed so violently that the bones could be heard cracking beneath the skin. Within minutes, he lost consciousness entirely, falling into a coma that no antidote, no purge, no magical interference could interrupt. For 7 days, Cale's body lay curled like a broken animal in the darkened infirmary chamber, tended only when necessary, monitored with the sterile interest of someone watching a rare insect pinned to a board. Varen, for his part, was unconcerned. He recorded Cale's descent into coma with the same dispassionate language one might use to log a change in temperature or humidity. Subject exhibited promising synaptic agitation prior to neurological collapse. Pulse stable. Right arm rigidity confirmed. Unresponsive to ocular stimulus. Prognosis uncertain. Potential metaphysical implications minimal. He did not stop his other experiments. He did not weep or pray. He simply moved to the next batch of toxins and continued to refine the process. When questioned by an apprentice, one of the newer, more naive ones, as to whether Cale should be taken to a temple or given clerical aid, Varen simply replied, if the gods want to save him, they would have intervened before he drank it. The phrase became a sort of grim joke within the lab, whispered whenever a vial hissed or bubbled ominously. But for Cale, drifting in a void of chemically induced paralysis, nothing was amusing. The coma was not sleep, not truly. His body was unresponsive, but his mind remained dimly aware, trapped in a cage of frozen muscle and flickering nerve signals. He dreamed, yes, but not in pictures or sound. He dreamed in sensation, cold spreading up his spine, invisible fingers clawing at the nerves in his arm, the slow burn of something alive trying to slither inside his skull. He remembered nothing clearly, but everything left a residue, like soot on stone. And when, after 7 full days, he opened his eyes, his first sensation was not relief, nor fear, nor even pain. It was absence, the absence of feeling in his right hand. The fingers hung limp, useless, flesh-colored rope at the end of his wrist. No muscle response, no strength, nothing. The physicians, one of whom had been brought in from the Eastern Quarter under some pressure from the city's guilds, confirmed partial neurolysis. The toxin had, by unknown mechanism, severed or decayed a significant section of his brachial nerve. Restoration was unlikely. Regeneration impossible. The hand was dead, not decomposing, but inert. And to Varen, this was not tragedy. It was data. Destiny, he murmured, examining Cale's limp fingers as though inspecting a flawed tool. This is what happens when flesh interferes with transcendence. He turned away before Cale could respond. Not that he expected one. And in truth, Cale didn't speak. He hadn't said a word since waking. Not to the apprentices, not to the healers, not even to the master. But inside, something had shifted. It was not grief. He had nothing left to mourn. It was not rage. He had no illusions about justice. It was doubt, a deep, creeping uncertainty about the nature of his role. Not the danger, not the pain, but the meaninglessness of it all. Varen had always treated him as a vessel, an instrument, a functional extension of the laboratory's processes. But Cale, for the first time, began to wonder, if he died, would the master even record the event with more than a line of red ink? Would his body be buried? Or simply burned with the rest of the failed experiments? This doubt festered. It did not overwhelm him. Cale was not the sort to be crushed by philosophical weight, but it burrowed, rooted like a spore into the places where fear used to live. He began to test the boundaries of Varen's indifference in subtle ways. He would delay cleaning certain tools, misplace small, unimportant items, spill a few drops of reagent where none should be spilled. At first, nothing changed. The master did not notice, or did not care. But over time, Kale realized that he was being watched more closely. The mirrored panels seemed to follow him longer. The apprentices began to avoid him not just with contempt, but with wariness. They sensed what he had become. Not a servant, not a victim, but something else entirely. Something broken, yes, but also something quietly dangerous. His right hand remained useless. He began to teach himself to do everything left-handed. Writing, mixing, grinding, tasks that once took moments stretched into hours. But he was patient, in silence. He retrained his body, one motion at a time. The others might have pitted him, but they were too afraid to say so. And Varen? He simply gave him more to drink, more compounds, more pain, more chances to die. Kale accepted them all. There is a certain kind of strength that grows only in those who have nothing left to lose. Kale no longer feared injury. He had already been maimed. He no longer feared madness. He had walked its edge for days, hearing things that did not exist. What was left to fear? Varen, with all his intellect and power, still needed someone to drink the unknown. And in that necessity, Kale found a strange sort of leverage. The more he suffered, the more valuable he became. The closer he came to death, the more irreplaceable he was. In a way, his destruction gave him power. Over time, the story of the 7-day coma became a quiet, cautionary tale among the other poison testers in the city, few as they were. Kale's name was never spoken aloud, but he was whispered about in corners of smoke-filled taverns, described with dread fascination. The boy who drank root and rust, they'd say. The one who sleeps with his eyes open. It was not fame, it was not glory, but it was survival. And survival, in Velhas Laboratories, was the closest thing to immortality a cleaner could hope for. And so Kale endured, left-handed, half-numb, sleepless. He watched, he learned, and he waited. If he was to leave a mark on history, it would not be written in books. It would be etched into the bones of the alchemical elite, carved from silence and poison. Varen believed in destiny. Kale believed in choice. And the first choice he made after the coma was simple. He would outlive the master, not through luck or hope, but through calculated, cold persistence. One sip at a time, one scar at a time, until he was no longer just a vessel, until he was the hand behind the poison, even if it was the left one. Among the many unremarked tragedies buried within the private ledgers of Velhas' lesser-known alchemical schools lies the quiet, uncelebrated death of a young apprentice named Toma. In the sterile history of laboratory records, his passing was recorded in no more than few dispassionate lines. Apprentice expired during compound intake. Cause, cardiac arrest. Variables, dosage unknown. Disposal handled. His name, like so many before and after him, was reduced to a scrap of administrative debris, an item to be cataloged, referenced once, and forgotten forever. But for Kale, the boy whose life had long been reduced to a daily pattern of poison and pain, Toma's death marked something far more profound than another lost assistant. It was, in its quiet violence, the last fracture in whatever lingering humanity Kale still possessed. Not because Toma was special in the eyes of the Academy. He was not. He was young, eager, hopeful, and foolish. But in Kale's increasingly rotted world of bloodless rituals and cruelty veiled as science, Toma had been the only person to look at him and speak his name without venom. Toma had arrived only 3 weeks earlier, wide-eyed and soft-palmed, still smelling faintly of ink and old parchment. He had trained at one of the minor guilds in the western provinces, where experiments were still conducted with the supervision of clerics and the belief, however naive, that alchemy could elevate the human condition. He believed, absurdly, in the dignity of the craft. He asked questions. He greeted Kale every morning. And he laughed. Actual laughter, not the hollow mutterings of madness or sarcasm that echoed in the senior chambers. To most, he was an annoyance. Too cheerful, too slow, too innocent. But Kale, who had not been greeted kindly in years, began to feel a faint echo of something he barely recognized anymore. Not friendship exactly, not warmth, but memory. Toma reminded him of a time when he, too, had believed that there was something worth becoming, That perhaps a boy from the gutters of Velhas could matter. The feeling did not comfort Cale. It made him wary. He knew hope was dangerous. Hope, in the wrong hands, got people killed. And so when the order came for Toma to test Compound 17A, an unstable reagent that had recently failed internal trials, Cale felt the old itch of dread behind his eyes. Varen, true to form, had diluted the mixture slightly and declared it safe for oral ingestion. But Cale had handled the base elements just days prior. He had smelled the bitterness of ground stone root in the mixture and tasted the familiar metallic echo of arsenic residue on the rim of the storage flask. Even in small amounts, arsenic was treacherous, cumulative, deceptive, a killer that worked not through violent symptoms but through silence. He had tried, the first time in years, to intervene. As Toma prepared the dose under the flickering amber lamps of the test room, Cale stepped forward, placing a gloved hand on the younger boy's wrist. "It's not safe," he whispered, eyes never leaving the vial. "There's arsenic still in it, not enough to taste, but enough to matter." Toma looked uncertain, hesitating in the middle of measuring. He didn't understand why Cale, the infamous poison tester who consumed things that melted iron and boiled blood, would suddenly object to something so seemingly mild. But before either of them could speak further, Varen entered. The master's presence was always chilling. A tall figure in worn robes stitched with alchemical glyphs long since banned by the city's guild council. His skin looked perpetually bleached, as though even the light refused to stain him. His eyes, pale and rimmed with dull blue circles, rarely blinked. He watched everything. He missed nothing. "Is there a problem?" he asked, not looking at Cale. Cale said nothing. Toma opened his mouth, confused. But Varen waved a hand before any protest could be voiced. "It's diluted. No more dangerous than tonic wine. Proceed." That was all. The weight of the master's word, as always, crushed argument beneath its heel. That night, Toma drank the mixture as instructed, under observation. Cale sat in the far corner of the lab, silent, numb, and already certain of what would happen. The symptoms began subtly: a dry throat, cold sweat, a faint tightness in the chest. Varen took note, but offered no aid. By the time Toma's breathing became irregular and the convulsions began, the master had already turned his back and begun writing down observations in his ledger. Cale did not move. He watched, hands clenched, jaw tight, as Toma's body seized and twisted, the boy's eyes full of terror and disbelief. He died before midnight. No one screamed. No one cried. The room was cold, and the lights dimmed without ceremony. They removed the body the next morning, wrapped in cloth and sent for incineration. Cale found himself staring at the empty space where Toma had once stood, half expecting to hear a question, a laugh, a greeting. Nothing. The silence was deafening. And in that silence, something inside Cale cracked. Not broken like a child's heart breaks, but like a fault line shifts beneath the earth. A cold, calculated rage bloomed in his chest. Not passionate, not noisy. A rage like acid, slow, permanent, and burning. He walked into the storage room that night, still shaking faintly, and took the nearest beaker, a thick green glass vessel with etched lines along its neck, and hurled it against the far wall. The sound was sharp, explosive, unnatural in the dead hush of the laboratory. It startled the apprentices, brought silence to the entire hall. Shards flew like frozen raindrops, scattering across stone and wood. But Cale didn't speak. He stood there, breathing slowly, chest rising with a fury that had no words. When Varen arrived moments later, drawn by the sound, he found Cale motionless, hands clenched, a single streak of blood running down his forearm from a wayward shard. The master looked around at the wreckage, then at the boy. He said nothing. He walked forward, raised his hand, and slapped Cale across the face. Not out of anger, not as punishment, but as correction, the same way one might discipline a dog that had broken a vase. "Control is the foundation of alchemy," he said softly. "Loss of control leads to error. Error leads to waste." Then, with a gesture to one of the other apprentices, he ordered the shards cleaned and left the room. Cale did not move for a long time. When he finally returned to his cot, he lay awake, staring at the cracked ceiling, tracing the memory of Toma's final breath over and over in his mind. He realized then something frightening, not just about Varen, but about himself. He had not cried. He had not screamed. The fury he felt was real, but had already been swallowed by something deeper, something calculating. Cold. Varen was cruel, certainly, but Kale had become something crueler in silence. He had watched Toma die and had done nothing, knowing full well what was coming. Even now, even with the rage still burning in his chest, he felt a small, awful satisfaction that he had been right, that his warning had been ignored, that the master's arrogance had borne fruit, that someone would remember that mistake. And in this grotesque, spiraling awareness, Kale began to change, not outwardly, not in any way that others might see, but something in the way he thought, the way he breathed, the way he measured his place in the world, had shifted. He no longer wondered whether Varen valued his life. The answer had been made clear. No more than the beaker, no more than the rat in the cage, no more than Toma. He began to plan. Not revenge. He was not foolish enough to believe he could strike the master down and live, but something quieter, longer, the careful, meticulous preservation of knowledge, the slow construction of his own legacy. He began to write in secret, copying Varen's formulae onto scraps of cloth, embedding them into the lining of his tunic. He memorized the locations of rare ingredients, the weight of specific toxins, the sound of boiling metals. He learned not just how poisons worked, but how they could be masked, delayed, combined with spiritual agents to affect not just the body, but the soul. Every lesson Varen taught became a stone in the foundation of Kale's silent empire, and all of it, every word, every calculation, was etched in the shadow of Toma's corpse. There was no further discussion of Toma, no eulogy, no mention. His name was never spoken again in the laboratory, but Kale remembered, and in time, when the moment came, when he was no longer a cleaner, no longer a poison tester, but something darker, something more, he would make sure that the world remembered too, not because Toma was his friend, not because Kale still believed in friendship, but because Toma's death had proven, beyond doubt, that silence was not neutrality. It was complicity. And Kale, even in his silence, had chosen a side, the side of memory, of calculation, of enduring long enough to leave a mark that no one could scrub away, even if it was written in arsenic. In the long, monotonous procession of forgotten alchemical incidents that litter the footnotes of Velhast's internal laboratory records, one event stands out, not for its destruction, which was relatively minor, nor for the compound involved, which was never officially cataloged, but for the simple fact that someone, for the first time in Master Varen's tenure, said no. It was a quiet word, barely audible, spoken without theatrics or visible defiance. But in the echoing stone corridors of that cursed laboratory, it rang with all the violence of heresy. That someone, of course, was Kale. No longer a boy, no longer a passive instrument of chemical experimentation. Kale had become something far more dangerous, a man with limits. And on that damp, smoke-stained evening, as he stood before the testing basin with a vial of shimmering silver-blue fluid in his hand, he crossed an invisible line that could never be uncrossed. The compound was called Aqueous Eye, a new creation of Varen's, said to interact with the optic nerve and enhance perception. But Kale, with his years of swallowing fire and venom, recognized the telltale signs of elemental mercury laced through the concoction, the way it refracted light, the sharp, almost sweet odor clinging to the glass, the viscosity that didn't match water or oil. He knew the symptoms that would follow: tremors, madness, tooth loss, and finally, death. And so, for the first time, he placed the vial back on the stone counter and said flatly, "No." Varen did not react immediately. He stared at Kale for a long moment, as though the refusal were a foreign tongue. Then he stepped forward and, in a tone colder than the laboratory's furnace core, said, "You will drink it or you will leave." The phrase was surgical in its simplicity. A scalpel meant to sever loyalty from usefulness. But Kale did not waver. His mind had long since hardened into something dense and unyielding, like the calcified skull of a creature that had grown used to impact. He said nothing. He simply reached into the fold of his apron and withdrew a small, battered ledger bound in flaking black leather. The Black Journal, Varen's personal experimental record. A volume so obsessively protected that even his senior assistants were forbidden from glimpsing its pages. Cale had taken it months earlier, in the sleepless hours following Toma's death, after memorizing the master's routine and discovering where the journal was kept, beneath a false panel in the eastern hearth. It was a dangerous thing to steal, a suicidal thing, but Cale had never intended to run with it. He intended to survive with it. He placed the journal on the table without opening it, letting the weight of its presence speak for him. "You expel me," he said, "and this leaves the building." He didn't say where it would go. He didn't need to. The threat was implied, and it was lethal. If the Guild Council got a hold of that journal, or the rival alchemical circles in the northern districts, Varen's secrets, his illegal procedures, his undocumented deaths, his unsanctioned formulae would be exposed. The old man's eyes flicked from the journal to Cale, then back again. For a moment, the air grew thick with pressure, as though the stone walls themselves were listening. But Varen, whatever his cruelty, was not stupid. He stepped back. "Put away," he said, and turned his back. The threat was not lifted. It was simply postponed. That night, the laboratory did not sleep. Apprentices worked in tight circles, whispering over half-cooled mixtures. Senior staff monitored reagents with hushed urgency. And Cale, stone-faced, deliberate, slipped back into the shadows of routine, but with a keen awareness that the ground beneath him had begun to shift. He had defied the master, and lived, not escaped, not triumphed, but endured. It was a victory of the most poisonous kind, silent, bitter, and short-lived. He knew Varen would never forget, and he knew he had just set something in motion that would not be stopped. At some point, near midnight, while the furnaces were still burning low and the rain outside painted the windows with long, trembling streaks, the fire began. It started in the Western Supply Annex, a room packed wall to wall with volatile compounds, tinctures, scrolls, and mineral stores. The smoke was discovered first, curling like a question mark beneath the iron doorframe. By the time anyone reached it, the flames had already devoured the wooden supports and were climbing the ceiling beams with eager, crackling fingers. Screams echoed briefly through the halls, followed by the crashing sound of glass exploding under pressure and the hissing shriek of heated mercury bursting into vapor. The fire did not spread far. Varen's laboratory was built mostly of stone, and his paranoia had ensured flame-proofing protocols in most of the high-value chambers. But the annex was lost. Along with it, several key mixtures, formula records, and a large portion of the master's personal mineral library. It was never determined how the fire started. The investigation was perfunctory, handled by a low-ranking guild inspector who noted the presence of flammable oils near an unstable reaction tray, recorded it as accidental ignition, and closed the case within the week. But everyone inside the laboratory, everyone who mattered, understood the truth. Fires like that did not just start on their own, not in a room that had remained untouched for days. And no one, not one apprentice or assistant, dared accuse Cale aloud, but they watched him differently after that. As he moved through the halls with his damaged hand curled at his side, his head bowed just enough to seem obedient, his eyes dull but not blind. They watched, not with contempt, not with fear, with calculation. They had begun to see what he had become, a creature born of fire, not merely tested by it, someone who had survived every toxin, every trial, every cruelty Varen could throw, and had emerged not cleansed but hardened, a human crucible, now capable of tempering others, of shaping outcomes, of fighting back. For his part, Cale said nothing. He never referred to fire, never mentioned the journal again. He returned it to his hiding place within days. He had never intended to use it beyond that single moment of leverage, but the message had been delivered. He had limits, and he had the means to enforce them. Varen's behavior shifted subtly in the following weeks. He no longer threatened Cale directly. He no longer handed him the most lethal substances without prior notice. There was a new dynamic now, one built not on trust or fear, but on a cold, functional respect. Varen knew Cale could not be broken like the others, And Kale knew Varen had never needed to love his tools to use them effectively. The fire also had an unintended consequence: the destruction of certain tracking ledgers. Records of compound iterations, dates of ingestion, side effects, and long-term mortality projections were lost. With them, the precise details of several critical projects were thrown into confusion. And in that confusion, Kale found opportunity. He began reconstructing the records himself, quietly, in the evenings, piecing together notes from memory and scraps he had hoarded. He filled in the gaps not with accuracy, but with alterations, false readings, redacted failures, doses modified by 1 decimal point. Nothing dramatic, nothing anyone would notice, but enough to ensure that, in the future, should anyone try to retrace certain experiments, they would follow a poisoned trail of knowledge, one that only Kale could correct. He had begun to think not merely in terms of survival, but in terms of legacy, influence, power, not the loud, obvious kind wielded by Varen, but the insidious kind that slithers beneath the surface of systems and silently redirects their outcomes. A kind of invisible authorship. By the time anyone noticed, it would already be irreversible. It was not revenge he sought. He had long since moved beyond revenge. What he wanted now was erasure, not of himself, but of the structure that had created him. The slow dismantling of the very order Varen represented, done not with flames or shouts, but with ink, lies, and silence. The fire became a rumor, then a footnote. New apprentices were recruited, new formulas tested. The world spun on. But inside the stone heart of that laboratory, a rebellion had begun, not with weapons, not with open revolt, but with refusal. A single word, spoken by a single man, who had nothing left to lose and everything to burn. And though Varen still wore the robe of authority, still held dominion over every process, every flame, every breath inside that building, he knew, somewhere in the back of his meticulous, bloodless mind, that Kale was no longer his to control, and that perhaps frightened him more than any fire ever could. Of all the compound to pass through the vaulted halls of Master Varen's laboratory, through its furnaces and flasks, through the lungs and veins of doomed apprentices, few caused as much quiet unease among the inner circle as a pale, glimmering elixir known simply as moonblood essence. Unlike the violent red tinctures of corrosion or the thick black oils of necrotic decay, moonblood was soft in appearance, a translucent lavender liquid that shimmered faintly in low light, as though stirred by some inner tide. It moved like water but clung to glass like syrup, and its scent was strangely clean, unsettlingly sweet, like cut lilies left too long in a warm room. The formula came from an incomplete manuscript unearthed from the wreckage of a failed expedition into the eastern jungles. Half-burned notes, fragments of glyphs, scribbled warnings in blood. Most regarded it as myth. Varen, of course, regarded it as opportunity. The nature of moonblood was a contradiction at its core. It was said to restore lost tissue, stimulate cell growth, and reverse minor internal organ damage, but only under perfect conditions. Any miscalculation in temperature, dosage, or timing turned it into a systemic poison, unraveling the nervous system in minutes. Even the surviving scrolls were cautious. One passage, translated roughly from its original tongue, warned, "The essence remembers the soul's weakness. If touched in hunger, it will nourish. If touched in doubt, it will destroy." Varen, for once, did not immediately act. For a man who had poured molten copper into rats to test pain thresholds, who had stripped the skin from frogs while still conscious to observe their muscle contractions, this hesitation was telling. He did not assign the usual test. He did not call for Kale. Instead, he left the vial sealed on the third tier of the cold shelf and moved on to other work. But Kale noticed. He always noticed. He had developed a talent, over years of suffering and silence, for sensing what frightened the master, not in the theatrical sense of fear, but in the subtle tensing of the jaw, the deferral of decisions, the tightening of Varen's hand when setting down a flask. Moonblood essence had unsettled him, and that alone gave it value. Kale studied the vial for 3 nights, watching the way its color shifted in response to temperature, observing the slow thinning of its viscosity under different lighting. He read and reread the notes Varen kept nearby, memorizing half-translated equations and untested heating diagrams. And finally, without asking permission, without being told, Kale prepared a dose. There was no audience, no ceremony. He measured out a single teaspoon of the solution, warmed it with body heat for 10 minutes, and drank it in silence behind the eastern furnace, just beyond the reach of the master's mirrors. It tasted like ash and snow. Cold flooded his throat. His stomach clenched, and for a long moment, he thought he had miscalculated. He staggered to the floor, gritting his teeth, clutching at his ribs as a sharp, burning sensation spread through his abdomen like hot glass cracking. His vision blurred. Time slowed, but he did not die. When he awoke, nearly 6 hours later, his body was slick with sweat, and his skin had taken on a faint bluish hue. The worst had passed, but the ache in his right side, deep and pulsing beneath the ribs, would never leave him. Within days, the internal symptoms became clear. Nausea, jaundice, brittle nails, exhaustion after minimal exertion. Varen brought in a physician to confirm what Kale already knew: permanent liver damage. Irreversible, manageable, but chronic. The dose had succeeded in activating Moonblood's regenerative properties briefly, enough to accelerate clotting from old injuries and clear infection. But the cost had been catastrophic, and yet Kale had survived. Where others had feared to test a line between remedy and toxin, he had crossed it, not for glory, not for discovery, but to prove that he could. The aftermath was quiet. Varen did not praise him. He never praised anyone. But something changed in the air between them. A silent exchange of acknowledgement passed, not warmth, not respect, but a nod between predators. Varen, for all his cruelty, understood the weight of Kale's act. He had faced death for the master's work, not because he was told, but because he chose to. And that choice, in Varen's twisted hierarchy, made Kale more than a tool. Not an equal, never that, but something useful in a new way. And so, for the first time, Varen granted him a privilege no other assistant had been given: access to the official ledgers. It was a small thing on the surface, a worn black book, stitched in gut string, kept beneath lock and key in the central chamber. But the ledgers were more than records. They were history, knowledge, truth. They held the names of every compound, the outcomes of every trial, the notations of every death. They were Varen's personal gospel. And now, Kale was allowed to write in them, not in the margins, not as a footnote, but as a recognized scribe of the lab's unfolding legacy. It was not kindness. It was utility. Varen's own health had begun to decline. His hand shook faintly in the mornings. His speech slurred slightly after long sessions at the furnace. He needed precision, and Kale, maimed and scarred though he was, still wrote with the care of a surgeon. In those pages, Kale found a different kind of power, not the raw, explosive kind he had once associated with fire or poison, but the slow, creeping authority of the archivist, the one who records, the one who remembers. He began to shape the narrative subtly. Not lies, never lies, but emphasis, language. He framed failures as experiments. He reworded fatal mistakes as threshold breaches. When he documented his own ingestion of Moonblood essence, he wrote it clinically. Subject self-administered 5 milliliters dose under controlled conditions. Initial reaction severe. Stabilization occurred after 6 hours. Long-term hepatic degradation observed. Potential for controlled healing applications remains. Subject remains active. But those who read between the lines would see more, would understand that he had gone where even Varen feared to tread, and had returned. It was in those weeks, hunched over the ledger by candlelight, liver aching and teeth slightly yellow from strain, that Kale came to fully understand the thinness of the boundary between cure and killer. Every compound they created, every brew and serum and paste, carried within the potential for salvation or doom. The difference was never the substance. It was the hand, the dose, the timing, the intent. Moonblood essence, he realized, was not unique in that way. It was simply honest. Its beauty and horror were not hidden. They shimmered plainly, like blood in moonlight. That was a lesson, not that some things were poison and others were medicine, but that the two were always the same, separated only by the narrowest of lines. A heartbeat, a breath, A choice. Cale began to think differently after that. Not just about the compounds, but about people, about power. He saw how easily one could be mistaken for the other, how kindness could rot into control, how obedience could disguise contempt. Varen, for all his posturing, had once been a healer. His early writings, rare, brittle tomes locked away in the university archive, spoke of purity, the restoration of balance, the advancement of life. But somewhere along the line, he had crossed that line and never returned. Now, he brewed death and called it progress. And Cale, for all his bitter compliance, had followed, was following, still followed, even now. But he also wrote, every night, when the fire dimmed and the lab went silent, Cale returned to the ledgers and wrote, not just what he was told, not just what was required. He wrote truths buried in the margins, encoded in glyphs, phrased as riddles or chemical formulas. He began, slowly, to make the ledgers his own, and in doing so, he laid the groundwork for something larger, something more enduring than flesh. Varen had always believed in dominion, over nature, over knowledge, over others. Cale believed in memory, in permanence, in the slow poison of forgotten facts rediscovered. His own body was failing, bit by bit, but his mind was sharp, and now his words had a place, a record. He never drank moonblood again. There was no need. One dose was less than enough, but he kept the formula, refined it, adjusted it, added notes in a cipher he had invented as a child in the gutters of Elhast. In time, someone else would read it. Perhaps they would understand it. Perhaps they would not. But they would see his name beside it, not in ink but in meaning. Cale had crossed the line, and he had survived. Just barely, but barely was enough. And so the lab churned on. Glass clinked. Fires roared. Vials hissed. People came and died and were erased. But Cale remained, a ghost in the corner, a wound that never closed, a scribe of poison and pain. And each time he dipped his pen into the ink pot, each time he wrote a single line beneath Varen's seal, he pushed a little further across the line that separated medicine from poison, truth from deception, life from legacy. And the ledger, once only Varen's, slowly began to whisper with new voice. Cale's voice, quiet, patient, unseen, but permanent. In the tedious, dust-choked annals of Elhast's laboratory archives, records sealed behind charred oak doors and seldom disturbed, the episode known merely as a 7-day coma is preserved in clinical, emotionless detail. It was a moment where alchemical ambition, human endurance, and reckless experimentation collided with the irreversible machinery of fate. Cale, already broken in body and rendered silent by years of ingestion and endurance, became the unwilling vessel for a mixture so potent it shattered his nervous system and redefined his place in the toxic world of Master Varen. The mixture, composed of the sap of the living root, a slow-creeping botanical rumored to possess faint sentience, and a heavy metal solvent, was theorized in late-night scribbles to catalyze neurological regeneration. Instead, it birthed a neurotoxin so insidious that even Varen, with his brittle detachment, had failed to anticipate its true lethality. The experiment's documentation is chilling in its cruelty. Compound ingestion administered according to protocol. Subject collapsed. Neuromotor responses ceased. Coma initiated. Duration, 7 days. Cale's fall into unconsciousness was sudden, violent in its stillness. Records note tonic spasms, auditory ringing, and ocular dilation. Clinical symptoms stripped of humanity. In truth, he tumbled into darkness before the crowd of assistants could muster even a whispered exclamation. It was a kind of silence that hollows bones. Wardrobes of glassware clinking softly, the hiss of alembics cooling in the corner, the whispers of the master's ledger turning pages. With the exception of the appointed healer, none intervened further. Cale lay curled at the foot of the central test chamber, limbs drawn rigid, his right hand twisted and unresponsive. Varen recorded the irregular heartbeat, noted stable, and moved on to the next experiment before the ink had dried. 7 days passed in utter isolation. The ledgers refer to it simply as coma period, 168 hours. Minimal intervention. Whether Cale dreamed during that time is unrecorded, but if he did, memory would have been swallowed by paralysis and narrow tunnels of pain. After the third day, Varen visited the infirmary alcove to observe the unresponsive body and nodded once, lightly, as if noting a draft under the door. It was not pity. It was not regret. It was procedural acknowledgement. Cale was not ill. He was data. When consciousness returned, it came in fragments. The hiss of steam, a faint clink of glass, the scent of boiled eucalyptus creeping from a healer's mixture. Cale opened his eyes to dim torchlight and smelled antiseptic vinegar. There was no relief, just absence of sensation in his right hand. That appendage once used to steady vials, to wipe away glass shards, to measure weights to the 10th grain, now hung as inert as a broken pendulum. The physician pronounced it nerve laceration, partial irreversible neurolysis, loss of motor and sensory function. The limb remained, but it was no longer his. Varen's notes dismiss it as a possible side effect of accelerated neurogenic recoil. In the Master's unforgiving glossary, the severed nerve was a footnote, not a tragedy. During recovery, Cale, always a silent observer, began to understand that he meant nothing beyond function to his master. Varen referred to the coma as destiny fulfilled, as though Cale had stepped into fate's preordained current and emerged altered exactly as meant to be. That death was never an option. That damage was not a penalty. It was a design of a man intoxicated with the thrill of calculated mortality. But Cale, once awakened, felt the first tremors of doubt. Not spiritual doubt. He didn't believe in redemption or morality, but doubt about meaning. Was he more than a tool to collect neurological anomalies? Had Varen paused at his bedside at all, or simply considered the drop in neuronal data successful enough? He didn't cry. He didn't revolt. He simply withdrew. With one hand, he began relearning everything he could no longer do. Mixing compounds, writing notes, grinding minerals. Each routine motion became a study in regeneration. Cale taught himself to measure with his left hand, calibrate doses by feel, open narrow vials one-handed. It was slowness made sacred. There was no pity in his behavior, no appeals. This was survival redefined. By the 8th day, Varen permitted him to return to the main floor, still silent, still obedient, but with visible consequences. The other assistants watched him from the corners of their eyes. Some pitied, some feared, but none doubted that he had been irrevocably altered. Varen's reaction did not soften. He resumed experiments, indifferent to the skeletal twitch as Cale walked past the burners. But he did nod once, quietly, as Cale moved to prepare a vial. A curt acknowledgement result. The man who called Cale's paralysis destiny treated it as inevitability. Still, in that stoic nod, Cale perceived something new, acknowledgement of usefulness beyond mere ingestion. He had survived what was meant to kill him. He was hardened. He was reliable. He would not die under scrutiny. Instead, he persisted. And in that persistence, he became more valuable than before. From that point on, Cale began to collect more than just failed mixtures and burning glass. He collected information, every sensory note, the dull pulse of the temple from mercury exposure, the tremor in the fingers moments before collapse, the echo in the skull when exposed to volatile salts. He memorized each failure and coded them in the margins of his mind. He kept scraps of parchment beneath his cot. Tiny diagrams, fractured glyph translations, half-words. He buried them in the straw bedding. None would find them there. He didn't keep them because they might save him. He kept them because he wanted record. If he was a vessel, at least he would carry truth. The sympathetic survivors of other laboratories spoke in hushed tones of Cale's namesake. The coma boy. They said he slept with his eyes half open, muttered with no sound. He became part ghost. Not because he was insubstantial, but because he existed in the liminal space between life and near-death experience. They whispered about the stiffness of his right wrist, how it trembled with phantom pain. Whenever fires roared in the lab, they imagined he had seen the door to beyond and stepped back, and only by force. But those rumors were never confirmed. Cale did not confirm them. He let them drift untethered. In the weeks after awakening, Varen's experiments shifted subtly. He began isolating his more volatile formulas behind double-sealed flasks. He did not explain. He did not apologize. But he did acknowledge, through altered protocol, that Cale had survived failure, the same failure others might have avoided. And so, Cale was given precedence. The first drop, the raw mixture, the untested dose. Not as a demonstration of trust, but as a test of data. Varen wanted results. Cale had proven reliable. And Cale accepted. But silently, always silent, he questioned. Did his survival matter to anyone beyond the ledger? Was the science worth the human cost? Varen had called it destiny. But Cale began to feel destiny was nothing but narrative imposed by the cruel. If his life was destiny, then destiny could kill him just as easily. If his life meant little, then he alone must decide its worth. In that stillness, the seed of something monstrous took root. The decision to be more than data. The coma changed him. Not physically alone, though the right hand remained dead, but metaphysically, it rewired his beliefs. Life was not a line to be finished. It was absence to fill. Power was not cruelty. It was persistence. And history, which Varen so arrogantly recorded in pristine ink, was nothing without someone who remembered. Cale, in that coma, lost feeling in his hand. He did not lose memory. In fact, he gained it. Every tremor, every spark of pain, every memory of the liquid burning his insides. It became evidence, proof that the body fails, that knowledge endures, that destiny is a word used by men too lazy to claim responsibility. He never asked for mercy. He never sought redemption. But he did spend nights, long, silent, solitary nights, learning to function again. He taught himself to draw intricate runes with his unaffected fingers, to mix poisons left-handed, to steady his pen when writing. And in those nights, he wrote down everything he had seen, felt, heard. He pieced together the formula for the living root compound, reverse-engineered Varen's logging patterns, invented codes. None of that was rebellion, not in flame, not in shout, but rebellion in permanence. Because Varen might consume flesh, scorch bone, crush nerves, but Cale would consume memory, record fact, and persist. In time, Master Varen resumed normal operations, or as normal as a laboratory of death and flame ever could. But Cale moved differently. He walked slower, carried fewer vials, but observed more. He leaned in when jars hissed. He measured the tilt of the meniscus at the bottom of a flask with calm precision. He taught himself to steady his breath when mercury trembled. Others called him broken. He called himself rebuilt. He understood at last that purpose can be forged in paralysis. That loss does not equal void. The coma had taken sensation from his right hand, but it had given him something more valuable: autonomy of thought. He didn't resent Varen for naming his suffering destiny. He resented the belief that suffering could be ordained. He believed instead that suffering demanded meaning. And meaning was something he would carve from memory, from ledgers, from fire-blackened notes buried beneath straw. If Varen expected him to die, or be forgotten, he was mistaken. Cale would not fade. He would remain. Thus, in the silence of that 7-day void, Cale acquired more than survival. He acquired purpose. And when he finally walked back onto the lab floor, empty right hand hanging inert, the others looked not at his disability, but at his resolve, at the absence of fear in his gaze. They saw a man who had looked at death and found not mercy, but method. And in that method, Cale found his future. Survival not by obedience, but by calculation. If destiny was the master's word, memory would become Cale's weapon. Among the dusty, seldom open volumes tucked beneath the vaulted ceilings of Velhast's alchemical annals, there lies a faintly scorched page recounting a name almost lost to time: Toma. His entry is clinical, cold, recorded with a detached precision befitting alchemical accounting. Apprentice expired following ingestion of diluted toxin. Cause, acute poisoning. Trace arsenic confirmed. But the records do not mention the tremor in the scribe's hand nor the silent adherence of Cale's gaze when that entry was made. Toma had been new to the laboratory, wide-eyed, earnest, easily intimidated. He had arrived under the early morning light, still smelling faintly of parchment and wax-sealed letters from provincial guild he'd apprenticed under. He believed, perhaps naively, that alchemy could heal, That careful study might elevate him from obscurity into respect. Cale observed too much not to notice the disquiet. In the mixture, he prepared for Toma. From his vantage among glass racks and ash-blackened burners, he had watched the diluted vial being poured. Its liquid pale and deceptive. Cale had handled the same chemical only days prior, and he had sensed a faint tang of arsenic, metallic, sweet, lingering. It was not enough to kill outright, but enough, he knew, to haunt the body for hours, to burn the organs softly until they failed. He stepped forward, gripped Toma's wrist, and offered the warning in a voice lowered to barely more than breath. It still contains arsenic, enough to matter. Toma paused, confusion flickering in his expression. He glanced at the vial tentative, and glanced at Cale, who did not flinch. But before Toma could reevaluate, before he could cast out on the Master's diluted verdict, Varen entered and extinguished the moment. Master Varen appeared in the test chamber with robes that felt older than time, stitched with faded glyphs of outweighed empathy in his eyes. Pale, cold, unblinking, swept the scene with practiced indifference. He stood before Toma and Cale, the air of authority heavier than any stifling chemical plume in the room. He allowed a long moment to pass, then murmured in his expressionless tone, "Proceed." There was no heed. There was no regret. The word closed debate like sealing a damned ledger. Toma, uncertain and trembling, obeyed. That was all that mattered. The experiment, such as it was, began under the muted hum of gas lamps. The brittle crackle of safeties locked in beneath shells of volatile reagents. Cale watched in the corner, clenched fist silent as steel, as Toma placed a compound to his lips. The liquid slipped past his teeth, the faint bitter aftertaste blooming on his tongue. Unassuming at first, then the tightening of chest muscles, the cold sweat that beaded at temples, the eyes widening in confusion and terror. Cale stayed outwardly still, heart snow-cold, knowing what no antidote nor potion could reverse. He had warned. He had watched. Madness seized Toma swiftly. Convulsions preceded silence, and then stillness, the kind that fills a room with unimaginable quiet. By midnight, Toma lay dead, thought extinguished, dream swallowed in drowning urgency. No aid arrived. No apprentice screamed. The Master recorded the death in red ink as though he noted a temperature drop. The body was taken out in the morning, wrapped, burned. The page closed, and the nameless room resumed its cleansing ritual. Flasks washed, tools sterilized, fire stoked for new mixtures. But Cale remained haunted, hardened, haunted again. In the aftermath, Cale did not weep. Compassion had long since been stripped away by the alchemy of survival. But rage, quiet, corroding rage, bubbled in his bones. That night, behind the rows of cool burners and beneath the low flicker of dying cinders, Cale walked into the supply annex. It was where the unused glassware stood, tall, green-tinted bottles lined like silent witnesses. His eyes, dim but focused, seized upon a thick, round-bottomed beaker, engraved with graduated lines fading from silver. Without thought, he tossed it against the stone wall. The beaker shattered with a shock that cracked glass and shot particles like frozen stars across the floor. The sound echoed unnaturally in the hush that followed. Apprentices fell silent. Flames licked softly in the crucible. The shards scattered underfoot, fine and menacing. It was not physical strength or threat. It was righteous fury unveiled in routing glass, the screeching ending of poised control. Cale stood among the debris, chest heaving, but silent, hands still, fury advancing slower than vengeance, more purposeful. Before anyone could speak, before shock could convert accusations, Varen arrived, drawn by the concussion of breakage and by the scent of indignation. He stepped into the wreckage as though entering a scene of expected failure. His eyes moved across the scattered glass, the broken lines etched in the stone, the single drop of blood winding down Cale's wrist from an accidental glass cut. Without expression, he reached out and slapped Cale, not in rage, not to punish, but as correction. The movement was swift and final, severing violence from reasoning. Control is the exercise of discipline, Varen said softly, voice devoid of warmth. Loss of composure is wasteful. Waste corrupts purpose. There was no dialogue, no empathy, just the assertion of control. Cale said nothing. He let the resentment condense in stillness. He returned to his cot, swallow the ache in his body, and stare at the ceiling until sleep fled and despair dissolved into planning. Within days, the laboratory resumed its lifeless rhythm. Glass chimed, fire hissed, vials were filled and drained. But Cale did not move among them as before. He moved more quietly, eyes guarded. His damaged right hand trembled with phantom pain, a permanent reminder of that night's rage. The apprentices now noticed a shift in his posture, his narrow gaze, the way he waited the glance of others before speaking. He might have appeared obedient, but beneath that outward compliance beat the first pulse of rebellion. Cale began to record again, this time not in the official ledgers, but in scraps he hid beneath straw bedding, in margins of rejected parchment, an almost invisible cipher edging inside of his tunic. He began to memorize Varen's formulas, the exact angles of flame, the durations of simmering, the critical weight of reagents, the time it took for a particular compound to hiss. He scribed mental accounting of failure points, lethal thresholds, antidote sequences that had never worked. The death of Toma crystallized something in him. Silence is complicity, warning is a weapon, memory is power. Other apprentices whispered of Cale's silence as something loaded. They said they could feel a weight hanging in the lab air, a static charge that crackled whenever someone dared to test a new vial in his presence. They spoke of Toma sometimes, rarely, softly, and though none voiced suspicion, all knew Cale's rage had been anchored in that loss. But no one accused. No official report was made. Varen never addressed it. He never asked Cale what had motivated the devastation, nor did he attempt apology or discipline beyond a single slap. The relationship remained locked in its old structure, Cale as tool, Varen as maker. But something new threaded between them. Knowledge. Cale held information not just about spray-dried powders or new tinctures, but about the fragility of obedience and the potency of dissent. He began to see the laboratory not as a place ruled by fire and flame, but as one dominated by history, written by the powerful, revised by the observant. Every night, when the lanterns dimmed and the only sound were the embers cracking in the central hearth, Cale traced formulaic echoes into his hidden fibers. He encoded warnings in chemical runes that only someone deeply immersed in alchemical lore could read. He buried arsenic thresholds, dosage fail patterns, reaction threshold diagrams, in cipher beneath flaking wallpaper of the annex. He began to rehearse scenarios. What if someone else drank a toxin unknowingly? What if the ledger was found by a rival guild? What if he had an audience in the future? Someone curious, someone willing to learn the truth. And he rehearsed his silence as strength. The silence that outlasts pain, the silence that becomes an archive, the silence that tames fear through implication. He did not speak. He did not cry. He wrote. He remembered. He waited. Over the weeks that followed, the memory of Toma's death faded in the official context. A new apprentice arrived. The compound was replaced. New mixtures flowed. The lab moved past the rupture without acknowledging it. But inside, Cale changed. No longer simply a poison tester. No longer silent by default. He had tasted what obedience could destroy. And he had chosen the opposite. To record, to challenge, to alter the archive from within. His fury after the beaker broke became his crucible, not of fire or acid, but of truth. The death of an apprentice became his lesson. Toma was not forgotten. Not by Cale. Not by those dust-drowned fragments of warning he planted in the laboratory's foundation. The only friend he ever recognized in that place of cruelty had died because warning was ignored, because caution was crushed by dogma. Cale smashed glass. He was silenced, but his act echoed. Silence is complicity, warning is power, memory is resistance. And in that knowledge, Cale found a purpose darker, deeper, more enduring than any flame. In the dusty, systematically organized annals of Velhast's alchemical records, where each incident is compressed into sterile lines of text, ghost notes beneath the glare of candlelight, lies an unassuming entry that nonetheless marks a pivotal fracture in the history of Master Varen's laboratory. It reads almost as an afterthought. Assistant refused trial of aqueous eye. Disciplinary measures considered. Those few words belie the truth of the moment, that someone, merely someone with no status, no power, but long aggregated scars and knowledge, had said no. That someone was Cale. His refusal was not explosive. There was no shouted defiance, no dramatic confrontation. He merely set a vial down on the cold granite counter, as still as extinguished flame beneath an alembic, looked up at Varen with calm resignation and refused. The compound, aqueous eye, shimmered before him, liquid silvered blue, offering false promises of sight enhancement and visionary clarity. Kale, tasting the past in its odor, mercury, faintly sweet and dangerously smooth, knew better, that the liquid tortured the optic nerve, poisoning beyond reversal, and so he said nothing more than a word, steady and unembellished. No. Varen's reaction was perfection of cruelty masked as authority. He stood under vaulted rafters, flickering gaslight sparkling off his gaunt features, and stared at Kale as though the refusal were a breach in physical matter, a tear in the tidy surface of obedience. He asked, voice measured, "Will you drink it?" When Kale remained silent but firm, the master's tone sharpened to the edge of command. "Then you leave." Expulsion was not a threat. It was a sentence, a removal from function, from purpose. Without Kale's labor, the vials would accumulate unlabeled. The flames would go unsupervised, sources of risk. The master calculated that threat, and knew that Kale had more to lose than prestige. Kale did not tremble. He did not try to negotiate. Instead, with measured deliberation, he reached into his tunic and withdrew the black journal. The black journal was legend. Varen's private ledger, bound in flaking black leather, with edge-warped pages and glyphs scored across the cover. It contained the master's unregistered experiments, undocumented casualties, secret trials. It was more than property. It was power. Kale placed it between them on the granite counter. His hand, scarred from years of burns and ingestion, shook slightly as he let it fall flat. "Expel me, and this leaves," he said. He did not specify where. Perhaps he would sell it. Perhaps he would bury it where others might discover it. But the silent threat was enough. Varen's gaze flickered, not with pity, but with calculation. He realized that to eliminate Kale would be to risk losing knowledge that could expose unlicensed experiments or unsanctioned toxicology. The master, cruel though he was no fool. He gestured curtly, "Put that away." And without another word, he turned and left, leaving the two of them amid the faint hum of glassware and flickering lamps. Control remained unbroken. The compound lay sealed, the threat postponed, and the line between obedience and revolt quietly redrawn. That night, the laboratory pulsed with tension, apprentices whispering corners over half-finished mixtures. Senior assistants monitored unstable compounds with unblinking eyes, and Kale, silent as a specter, moved through the halls with new awareness. He had resisted, he had threatened, and, most significant, he had survived. The rest of the lab, consciously or not, sensed a shift. The vulnerability that had once made Kale an ideal vessel now rendered him dangerous. If control unraveled, loss of order would follow. Near midnight, some say after the fifth bell, flames erupted in the western annex, part of the archive where volatile tinctures, rare minerals, alchemical scrolls, and leftover glassware were stored. The fire emerged with unnaturally neat precision, not from stray sparks, not from accidental ember, but from a single corner where brushes of cloth lay near solvent, and where glass bottles, packed too closely, shattered into fuel. Smoke curled upward in elegant plumes as if painting the laboratory's shadowed ceiling, and then leapt into full flame. The hiss of boiling mercury sounded like wailing banshees. Glass imploded. Air heaved in smoke, flame, desperate shouts. As walls darkened and beams fell, the response was swift. Other servants rushed the crackling doorway with buckets, water, linens, and quicksilver-absorbing powders. They rescued scrolls, extinguished small fires, saved themselves, and left charred fragments where the annex had stood. But the cause was never determined. The official report, drafted by the low-ranking guild inspector, called it accidental ignition due to unstable reagent residues. It was closed within days, details suppressed and burned. Yet inside the lab, the cause was known, felt. No one faced Kale with suspicion, but no one questioned the silence either. They watched him quietly. They saw how he stood by the door, unaffected by the panic, hands downcast, eyes unreadable. They saw his cold-colored hair lit by the fire. They realized he had become something else. Not a victim, Not a hero, but a catalyst. Someone capable of refusing death and demanding accountability, and then perhaps capable of unleashing chaos. Cale did not confirm or deny. He left the journal hidden again within days. He never used the thread again, but the message had been delivered. He had limits, and the black journal lay in idle possession, a guarantor of survival. In the aftermath, the archives were rebuilt. Stones reset, shelves reconstructed, glass flasks restocked. The loss slowed Varen's projects only briefly, but something inside Cale had changed fundamentally. He walked to the laboratory no longer as an invisible cleaner, poised only to serve, but as someone acutely aware of his own significance. His damaged right hand, curled and inert, trembled when he moved and reminded others not of weakness, but of endurance. His ruined finger joints whispered of past trials endured and warnings unheeded. He did not speak slogans. He did not preach. He wrote, in secret ink on leather, on parchment scraps buried beneath straw bedding, and inside folds of his robe's inner seam. Cale began to record. Formulas whispered by apprentices, glyphs he overheard, risks he observed. He wrote warnings in chemical cipher, encoded in botanical sketches, traced in marginalia indecipherable to casual eyes. He began to assemble a silent archive, not a discovery, but a descent. In the weeks that followed, mastery in Varen's lab resumed its clipped rhythms. Fire ignited, glassware rattled, fumes hissed, compounds tested. Apprentices came and left. Some died, some were praised. The system reassessed its functions and replaced the missing stock. But Cale moved differently. He leaned in during tests bearing mercury salts and aqueous eye prototypes, studied flame angles from the east burner, memorized how long specific compounds hissed before darkening, timed the distortion of glass beneath acid. He recalibrated his left-hand mixing routine to compensate entirely for his right. He didn't need control. He needed autonomy. In that autonomy, he found power. Varen continued to treat Cale as expendable. He continued to hand him raw doses, volatile matter, radical reagents. But he also began to look at him more carefully, measuring maybe the line between loyalty and liability. There were moments, quietly observed by other assistants, when Varen paused before signing a test vial to Cale. He paused, as though calculating not just risk to Cale, but risk to his own secrets. That pause was acknowledgement, not of respect, but of consequence. Cale had become necessary, not because he obeyed, but because he couldn't be broken. The black journal remained hidden until long after the fire's ashes cooled. Cale returned it to its place beneath the hidden hearth panel. He had never intended to expose Varen's secrets in crass spectacle. He needed it only as assurance, as quiet leverage. He no longer touched it, but knowing it existed gave him something beyond fear. It gave him agency in a system built on denial and suppression. And that agency transformed his endurance from reaction into strategy. In the years that passed, the fire in the annex became a minor footnote. Partial archive lost due to fire. Recovered 85% materials. No structural damage. Cause undetermined. Order returned. New apprentices trained. New tinctures tested. And yet, beneath that enforced order, the laboratory had shifted. Fear still held sway, but uncertainty had taken root. The apprentices, once silent and complacent, parted their brows when Cale spoke. They watched the way he judged mixtures, the way he measured doses, the way he refused to flinch at dangerous fumes. Varen's presence remained dominating, but faintly precarious. His dominion no longer felt absolute. Cale did not overthrow him. He did not start a rebellion of shouts or shaking swords. The insurrection he began was subtler. It lived in margins, in secret writings, in coded observations. It wandered in the reflections cast by glassware, in slightly altered dosage logs, in rehearsal scripts hidden in memory. Each night, Cale reviewed chemical glyphs, scribbled half-annotations into scraps, memorized thresholds of poison. He constructed a subversive knowledge base as slowly and patiently as poison dulls nerve endings. It was invisible. It was unstoppable. It outlasted cruelty. It survived destruction. The first rebellion was not bold. It was quiet. It was wordless. It was glass that refused to bear more weight, journal gagged through silence. It was arsenic warnings ignored and recorded. It was refusal. It was survival. And it was a fire. The fire that might have been an accident or might have been deliberate, but which burned exactly at the threshold of control, at the edge of complicit order. Where fate is claimed by authority, rebellion blooms in refusal. Kale had refused. Kale had exposed leverage. Kale had endured. And in that endurance, he had begun something lasting. Not a coup, not a riot, but the tarnishing of absolute power by memory, documentation, and cold, indestructible silence. In the monotony-laced annals of Velhas laboratory history, where each entry is distilled into terse observations beneath time-darkened oil lamps, there emerges a gradually unfolding chapter known only as the cost of survival. This record marks the slow transformation of Kale, not merely into a vessel of endurance, but into something both feared and pitied, a cipher of sustained existence, numb to the world that claimed him. At first, his loss of sensation was subtle. The brush of feather across the palm elicited no response, and the muted clinks of glass vials fell softer at his ears. Then taste dulled. The bitter, metallic tang of acid no longer pricked his tongue, nor did the sweetness of alchemical extracts offer fleeting reprieve. Touch, hearing, emotion, one by one, they slipped through his grasp, leaving behind only the quiet echo of his name in Varen's ordered ledger and the merciless certitude of survival. It was as though each test, each poison, each moment carved away another sliver of sensation until Kale stood as a living relic, present, visible, effective, but increasingly hollow. It was during the months of what the master called refinement testing that Kale began to understand the cost of his endurance. Day after day, he received doses calibrated to test nerve threshold, liver degradation, pulmonary resilience. The laboratory staff measured his vitals, pulse, respiration, reflex, documenting every twitch of lightning in his nerves, every small burn or bruise mottling his flesh. What they failed to record, what they could not measure, was what he lost: the joy of feeling air on skin, the sharpness of flavor, the resonance of his own breath. He learned in cold and stark detail that survival is not merely about staying alive. It is often about what one sacrifices to remain so. Varen, in his own cruel way, noticed a change. He began to refer to Kale by a new title, the Immortal One. The designation was half praise, half derision, or perhaps entirely dismissal. Immortal, impervious to poison, immune to collapse, unbreaking in the face of toxicity. But Varen did not consider immortality in its subtler form, undying, yes, but unfeeling. To the master, it must have appeared miraculous. A body reshaped by exposure, hardened into something mechanical, clinical, never human. Sometimes Varen would utter the phrase under his breath while passing Kale in the hall, in a tone both reverent and mocking, as though summoning the ghost of a tool long tested by flame. But Kale, inside, felt only emptiness. The fading of his senses became a slow, creeping fog that dulled his days. The hum of the furnaces transformed into distant static. Fire leaped without crackle. Air moved without whisper. When he passed a sweating jar of mercury or inhaled the residue of vapors, the corrosive sting no longer registered. It was as though his nerves had been anesthetized not by medicine, but by incremental trauma. Kale began to question. If sensation is a boundary that separates presence from oblivion, what remained when that boundary dissolved? Was he still alive, or merely sustained in a shell of flesh? Other assistants noticed. They saw the way he ran his fingertips over the edge of burners and felt nothing. They remarked quietly that he sometimes failed to withdraw his hand in time from a heated flask into the iron cookplate's singed palm, yet he felt nothing. They watched him sip tinctures that made apprentices gag from first whiff, and saw Kale register no reaction. Some whispered that he had become more machine than man, that Varen, in his pursuit of experimental data, had unknowingly created something uncanny. Others felt pity for existence preserved at the cost of human experience. But none spoke aloud. Fear, always, remained the dominant language in those halls. One evening, as the sun set beyond the high, soot-lined windows and the lab's lanterns flickered their tired yellow flame, Kale stood before a counter of vials filled with azure tincture. He raised one to his lips and paused, not because the smell offended or the heat intimidated him, but because he realized he would taste nothing, The realization brought something of horror, not pain, but loss. He swallowed. Of course, he had perfected swallowing. There was no gag, no spasm, just the act, no sensation. Afterwards, he reached out to steady himself on the counter, his fingers brushing the cool stone. He expected some subtle feedback, but felt nothing, nothing at all. In that nothing, he recognized a vast gulf created by silence and survival. Varen noticed a change in Cale's behavior. Not every day, not in direct speech, but sometimes while writing in the ledger or overseeing another test, he would tilt his head, stare at Cale the way one examines a rare specimen. Cale's face was pale, undemonstrative. His eyes, sharp, intentional, half-shrouded, focused on tasks. But there was no flicker of pain, no sigh of fatigue, no hint of relief. When assistants passed, they saw Cale as neither man nor ghost, but as someone carved from endurance, carved of absence. Yet in the quiet, lost hours, Cale felt something stir, a question emerging from the void of feeling. If taste, touch, hearing, emotion all faded, was there a point in survival? If life was measured not by breath alone, but by presence now slipping, what remained? The question was slow poison in his mind. It grew in nights when the lab lay silent except for distant embers, when even dreams no longer stirred, when sleep carried no release but extended the numbness. He lay awake, staring at the stone ceiling, asking himself, am I alive or merely sustained? There were moments when he wondered if he would prefer death to this emptiness, that what he feared was not dying, but never truly living again. Death would be sharp, painful, final, but this, a perpetual suspension of sensation, was unending. It was infinite quiet, infinite darkness, infinite absence. And at times, Cale cursed himself for enduring it so long, for surviving under circumstances that erased him. Still, he persisted, because he felt he had no choice. Because the knowledge he gathered, the warnings he encoded, the silent archive he maintained, it mattered more than his own sensation. He wrote not because he felt, but because he remembered. He remembered the taste of iron, the sting of acid, the tremor of fear that long ago coursed through his skin. He carried those memories as proof of life, proof of sacrifice. Even as he lost everything else, he would retain knowledge. He would remain, for others who could still feel, for future voices who might unravel the cruelty hidden behind silence. In time, Varen began to place more trust in Cale's objectivity. The master would consult him after toxic trials, ask for notes on residue, ask for calibration data. Cale offered precise, unemotional observations, untainted by response or bias. To Varen, that was invaluable, a consistent observer not affected by emotional reaction. And so Cale gained a position more influential than before, not as toxin subject, but as recorder, calibrator, analyst. His commentary, dry, measured, impersonal, guided subsequent experiments. He had become vital. Ironically, the cost of feeling rendered him indispensable, but Cale felt no satisfaction. There was no warmth in recognition. Instead, he felt deeper pangs of absence. He heard his new title, the Immortal One, as if it were a ceremonial curse. Immortality that consumed sensation was not triumph. It was emptiness, and still he could not escape. Not when every test, every recorded trial, every blurry memory required him. He was bound to the data, to the lab, to the ledger, bound to the archiving of cruelty disguised as exploration. The question continued to grow. Are you alive if you cannot feel? Are you still you when nerves fail, taste fades, memory dims? Cale could answer only one truth. He remained. He endured. The body, once tender, once burning, once alive in myriad trembling ways, was now inert, but the mind remained alert. And so he clung to intellect, to memory, to the slow method of documentation. If flesh failed, at least knowledge survived. At least memory could resist oblivion. By the final years covered in the records, Cale had become legend among assistants. They spoke of him in quiet tones. The Immortal One, they whispered. The man who could not feel. They shivered, not from pain, but from remorse. For they knew his suffering was invisible, his sacrifice silent. But they also understood danger, for Kale had become a repository of the lab's secrets. And secrets have power. Kale did not mourn the loss of sensation. There was no mourning left in him. He simply continued. He recorded. He observed. He survived. And in survival, he confronted the ultimate question of existence. Was he alive? He did not know. Perhaps no one would ever know. Except this, he continued. He endured. He remembered. And history, which Varen tried to crystallize in clinical authority, would still hold the faint whispers of what it meant not to feel, but to persist. In that persistence, Kale found his purpose. Not to feel, not to serve, not to obey, but to remember, to endure, and to exist even as sensation faded, because history needs witnesses, even silent, even numb. And Kale, the immortal one, remained one. Kale's escape did not arrive in a crescendo of violence or high drama. It came quietly, in the monotonous hum of the laboratory's night shift, when flames simmered low and Varen's footsteps receded into the echoing halls beyond the eastern furnace. He walked through the rows of glass racks with the silence he had perfected over years, past jars that glowed faintly in the gloom and shattered retorts that clinked softly under lantern light. He carried the black journal, bound in flaking leather, its pages trembling with the weight of unspoken formulae, and a single key manuscript, a brittle parchment salvaged from the Master's hidden archive. The manuscript contained experimental protocols for antidotes and obscure elixirs, details of poison thresholds and emergency treatments, formulas never before recorded in public. Kale did not steal to destroy. He stole to survive. He had clipped the journal free from its secret panel behind the hearth and slipped into the stacks, and that night, with no beating of drums or clang of chains, he simply walked away. He had spent years memorizing the labyrinthine layout of Varen's citadel, the hidden stairwells, the ventilation shafts, the supply tunnels beneath the annex. He knew where inertia would lull attention, where the embers of the east furnace flickered without watch, where apprentices paused to record dosage logs and the Master retired from midnight manuscripts. He carried with him ragged scraps beneath his tunic, coded glyphs, poison thresholds, antidote sequences, and the full weight of the black journal in a simple leather satchel. He paused only once, in the passage beyond the library, when he heard the faint clink of footsteps approaching. He pressed himself into the shadow of a scroll rack, heart hammering, a sound he had rarely felt in years, and let the footsteps glide past. The guard did not notice the absence of the door's latch. Kale exhaled, tightened his grip on the satchel, and continued. No cheers, no rescue, only emptiness and possibility. The city beyond Varen's walls was unfamiliar at first. The smell of wet stone when rain fell, the chorus of voices in markets that hawked rare reagents and domestic herbs. Kale moved among crowds with eyes low, hood drawn, body taut. He avoided inns and crowded taverns, finding rooms in outlying lodgings frequented by merchants and traveling apothecaries. He spent nights copying manuscript pages into smaller notebooks, rendering them in cipher, binding them into leather pouches tied at his waist. He used watermark parchment to smuggle small sections of antidote formulae into hidden pockets, distributing them anonymously at clinics run by street healers. In each city he passed, he left behind knowledge, basic antidote recipes, instructions on neutralizing arsenic and mercury exposure, guidance for treating corrosive acid burns. He never claimed credit. Many who benefited would never know his name. But in the subtle arc of his disappearance, he became something unseen, an emissary of forgotten mercy. He survived by offering treatment to poison victims in squalid back alleys, hidden clinics, the barns behind poor houses. Word traveled among beggars, street runners, minor healers. There's a stranger who knows how to treat white arsenic. There's someone who can reverse the delirium of copper solvent. Go quietly, don't speak of his past. His voice in those places was soft, measured, not medical showmanship, but hushed instruction in whispered corners. He demanded nothing, accepted only food or lodging, and left handwritten notes, tiny diagrams, annotated ingredient lists, for whoever cared to keep them. He traced a margin of formulas with botanical sketches, so precise they might be mistaken for actual plants by an unaware eye. He garbage changed his appearance in each city, hair trimmed, clothes swapped, cloak dyed dark to hide soot stains. But he did not hide his purpose. He let his hands, still trembling with residual nerve damage, measure tincture doses, steady flasks, administer poultices with accuracy honed in years of suffering. Night after night, he healed victims of slow poisoning. Workers who cleaned copper vats poisoned by fumes, merchants who swallowed water lead paying for adulterated wine, or children who touched the residual mercury in alchemist refuse. To each, Kale offered remedy, a carefully prepared batch of activated charcoal, and herbs to bind the toxin, a poultice steeped in thistle and soot to soothe burns, a silent prayer to survival. It was not holy work. It was survival work. He did not ask to be thanked. He did not stay to see if the remedy succeeded. Once the wound was bound or the tincture administered, he left. He had heard once that healing was alchemy's true purpose. He doubted it now, but he believed relief granted purpose. Varen's name, wherever he trudged through distant cities, remained unspeakable. Each time Kale leaned close to arrange a dose, he remembered the master's cold sneer, the slapping correction, the record of death. But he did not carry vengeance. He carried knowledge. He had seen what obedience cost. He had learned that silence is complicity, that the only cure for cruelty is memory made accessible. And in every clinic built from straw mats and wounded limbs, he rebuilt semblances of care. The alloy of poison and remedy became his currency. He carried the black journal with reverence, but he copied only selected passages. The treatment protocols for corrosive ingestion, the threshold tables listing lethal dosages, the antidote preparation methods. These he transcribed into latex-bound notebooks. The sections describing human testing, detailed dosage ingestion, slow deaths he kept sealed. That was his leverage. Should any violent faction seek his power, he traveled light. Each notebook fit in the folds of his cloak. He recopied the antidote formulas and botanical cipher he had developed in the back rooms beneath the annex, mixing knowledge and code until only he could parse them fully. His senses continued to diminish as he traveled, taste, touch, hearing blurred, but he compensated with sharpened memorization. He could hear the shift in vapor hiss as reagent proportions tipped, detect the burn in the flask by tone, judge the decolorization of tincture by the faintest shade shift. He guided others to replicate what his numb body no longer fully experienced. He taught street healers to map symptoms to formulae, vomiting and tremors to arsenic, burning throat and shortness to mercury, blurred vision and trembling to copper. He offered lists, guidelines, flowcharts that survived the loss of sensation. He wrote them in small glyphs, easy to trace with finger if someone else had lost their sight or hearing. His left hand moved with certainty. His right remained limp, but his mind recorded every variant, every dosage calculation to the 10th grain. He stayed months in a single city sometimes, until the local healers learned to replicate antidotes, and his presence was no longer needed. Sometimes he dropped, leaving notes sewn into the hems of their blankets, coded margin warnings in the manuals they used. Then he moved on, city to city, clinic to clinic. Poison encounters in marketplaces, spills in households, accidents in taverns. They named him in whispered rumor, the ghost sage. He never sought it, he allowed it. For each place he passed, he carried memory forward. He made sure that the knowledge Varen attempted to throttle could survive, not in ink locked behind oak doors, but in open hands. Years passed. Kale was no longer young. His bones ached. His liver, damaged by moon blood essence long ago, deteriorated slowly. His skin was permanently tinted with traces of toxic residue. But he endured. He refused to succumb. He balanced frail life on the demand that others learn. Each time he offered treatment, he reminded himself that he refused to be erased. That survival cost sensation, but built something else. Utility, memory, survival for others. He told no stories of Varen. He asked no confessions of past subservience. He offered antidote. He offered notes. He offered possibility. Occasionally, he returned to the manuscript passages he had hidden in his notebooks. He iterated improvements, hoped to reduce liver damage by adding sheep's bile to certain formulas. He added a note on ginger root infusion to accelerate detox. He appended glyphs for safe procedure. Those marginalia were his legacy in microform. He would never return to Velhast, never faced Varen again. But he carried the ledger's truth in his mind and heart. He carried it to places Varen could not reach. By the time his hair grayed and his hand tremors grew more rapid, people called him the wandering healer of poisons. His method spread quietly across alchemical networks. Some wrote formulas into herbal compendiums with no attribution. Others recited them as oral tradition beneath smoky mats. His map thresholds became part of guild teachings and fringe schools. He watched from a distance, never greeting, never recognized, satisfied only by knowing that what Varen turned meant to kill, he had turned to restore. He studied the ledger's secret passages so long that he barely needed it. He carried experiment data in his mind. He carried recipes in hidden wax tablets sealed beneath convention. And he carried memory that a man with no power can still shape the fate of many. In his final years, he allowed a few to see his notes, trusted apothecaries, herbalists, street doctors, and instructed them to continue, to archive the antidote compound guidelines, to pass them in teaching, to whisper them in marketplaces. He did not ask for recognition. He asked only for continuity, that the tide of cruelty might recede against the flow of toxins and memory might overpower silence. And then he vanished, not with fanfare, not with illness, not with public grief, but with the persistence of his writings scattered across cities, sewn into archives, recited in quiet clinics. Kale's escape was not an act of rebellion in the dramatic sense. It was never recorded in the annals of Velhast. There is no epilogue in the Master's Ledger, but in the aftermath, as slow poison and antidote followed one another around towns, as clinics learned to treat the previously untreatable, as families survived copper-solvent burns and arsenic exposure because someone knew what to do, Kale's legacy endured. He became a ghost in history books never written, a footnote in healing compendiums never credited, a silent rebellion of knowledge carried on wind-swept roads. He had escaped Varen's cruelty, but more importantly, he escaped annihilation at the level of memory. And in memory lived survival, antidote by antidote, schematic by schematic, city by city. Kale, having lost sensation, preserved meaning. Having escaped cruelty, he taught mercy. And though the world might never know his name, they would know relief, they would know survival. That was escape. That was legacy. In the marginal kitchens of city manors, within smoke-darkened clinics behind mercenary camps, and alongside fevered battlefields scattered across nobility and militia alike, there arose a figure known to few and whispered about by many. Kale, the wandering antidote maker, the anonymous healer who drifted from city to city, carrying little more than his battered satchel of codified manuscripts, the black journals distilled fragments, a battered left hand steady with resolve, and a tongue so attuned to poison that nobles paid him silent tribute in gilded dinners, and generals sent for him across blood-soaked fields. He had become, in the hushed corridors of whispered rumor, the silver tongue, the man who could taste death and yet survive long enough to speak the remedy. His presence was neither pomp nor spectacle. No herald trumpeted his arrival. No banners proclaimed his cause. Instead, he entered kitchens at dusk under the guise of quiet consultant, angled among peppercorn and garlic. Sampling the first spoonful of sauce meant for a noble's plate, his palate trained to detect the faint metallic trace of lead acetate with a faint watery burn of diluted mercury, poisons that would kill swiftly, painlessly, invisibly. With barely a lifted eyebrow, he spat discreetly into a cloth, noted the aftertaste of his memory, advised substitutions or antidotes beneath the breath of servants, and slipped away before breakfast. He treated high-born banquets the way others might handle fine porcelain, carefully, with hidden knowledge of how easily something could crack. But Kale's fearlessness in noble households derived not from arrogance but from purpose. He had lived years ingesting substances that blistered the stomach, clouded the mind, destroyed nerves, and left him half alive in sensation. To him, the faint trace of arsenic or chronic mercury was not novelty, but familiarity. He diagnosed poisoning by taste alone. He held the wine or soup under his tongue for seconds, judged the shift in aftertaste, the weight of the liquid on his tongue, the iron tang that adhered after swallow. Then, almost always, he fixed it. He prescribed swift remedies, activated charcoal ground with rue and vinegar to bind the arsenic, heated milk thickened with egg white to absorb mercury, poultices scented with mint and thistle to clear digestive burns. His instructions whispered through kitchens. Mix this powder in cool broth, heat carefully. Stir 3 times clockwise, administer in small doses over an hour. The remedy worked. The noble recovered discreetly without scandal. The courtiers credited it to a foreign physician or a guild healer. Kale vanished before praise could form. Beyond noble households, Kale traveled to regions where war and betrayal were common. Small border towns burned by skirmish, fields scattered with casualties whose wounds reeked of rusted metal, sharpened blades, chemical residue from alchemical weaponry. Officers hired him to treat battlefield wounds infected by corrosive compounds or poison assaults used in alchemical sabotage. He mixed paste of vinegar, garlic, charcoal, fresh water to draw corrosives from flesh, neutralize residual toxin, ease pain. He instructed field surgeons to irrigate burns with honey thistle decoction, to bind wounds with salted linen, to watch for swelling and treat it early. The soldiers whispered that his hands were steady despite the tremor in his right wrist, that he moved methodically, precisely, almost mechanically. No cries of pain, no hesitation. He would drop the poultice, not the bandage, and leave before nightfall, often with only a crust of bread and a flask of weak tea as thanks. In the smoky aftermath of wounds and betrayal, Kale became essential, not celebrated, rarely remembered, but quietly indispensable. His methodical approach became legend. First taste, then diagnosis, then remedy. He recorded everything in faint cipher in small notebooks sewn into a satchel. Ingredient weights the 16th of a grain, temperature guidelines, symptom progression charts, antidote mixture timelines. He kept botanical sketches annotated with effective dosage and risk threshold. Each entry was coded with careful symbols, so only he could read them after years of memorization and silent study. And though his senses dulled over time, taste, touch, hearing fading like old tape, his memory remained sharp. He could recall formulas and thresholds even when his senses failed. His assistants, young healers he sometimes trained in remote villages, learned to interpret his notes, to emulate his taste test regime, to replicate the remedies. But they never knew his face. They only knew his instructions, whispered in dim lamplight. Use this charcoal mix first, then wheat hull infusion, then plaster of bread to blot the residue. Check the pulse at wrist. If it slows, restrict dosage. They followed. They healed. The poison receded. The patient recovered. Kale rarely stayed in one place more than a fortnight. Wherever he went, he left behind hidden manuscripts tucked beneath clinic mattresses, sewn into gowns, carved into panels behind dispensary tables. These contained simplified instructions, identifying poisons by taste and color, basic antidote recipes, cautions about dosage to prevent liver damage. His codes worked on principle. A tiny plant glyph meant activate charcoal. A circle crossed by a line meant defer mercury exposure for 24 hours. These artifacts circulated like folklore, uncredited, unattributed, but potent. He became mythic. The silver tongue whispered in herbal circles as a ghost, a legend, a hushed cautionary name. His body aged slowly, measured not by sensation, but by function. He carried the weight of a crippled right hand, still numb, still useless, but with the left hand trained to manage flasks, dose tinctures, grind herbs. His liver, scarred by past experiments, provided chronic pain, but never stopped functioning. He sharpened his mental acuity to compensate for sensory loss. He memorized incremental flavor differences, from faint bitterness to full metallic aftertaste. He memorized symptom to poison progression. Nausea within the hour meant arsenic. Numb tongue next day meant mercury. Trembling hands signaled copper-solvent poisoning. His timing guides taught how quickly to respond, what to mix, how to apply compresses, how to advise rest. He offered hope where official healers failed. He offered relief in failed cities. He offered knowledge among suffering. Kale never sought credit. He refused reward. If a noble tried to grant him payment, he accepted only a coin or two and left instructions anonymized. If a field commander offered lodging, Kale stayed only long enough to render treatment. If a village pleaded for guidance, he wrote ingredient lists in simple cipher and moved on. His purpose was not renown. It was memory and survival. Poison demanded knowledge, and knowledge demanded transmission. Kale understood that. He had also understood Varen's cruelty, the deliberate ingestion trials, the erasure of assistance, the rewriting of history in a single ledger. Kale became the antithesis, a living repository of antidote, refusing erasure. Over time, rumors about the silver tongue shifted from whispers of fear to cautious reverence. Some claimed he could taste death and know exactly which poison had been used. Others claimed he healed assassins' victims or reversed curses inflicted by alchemical sabotage. Mothers told frightened children that if you were poisoned by stray fumes or tainted fruit, the silver tongue might come for you, and his arrival meant survival. Guild scribes in distant towns recorded antidote remedies and medicinal manuals with no author named, only noting as taught by the stranger healer, anonymous. In those footnotes lay Kale's legacy, silent, uncredited, but alive in practice. In rare moments, he paused in quiet reflection beneath moonlit streets, unaware of being watched, while scribes wrote these unattributed methods into manuscripts. He checked on the clinics he had aided months earlier, finding local healers following his guidelines. He observed from a distance, villagers administering charcoal broths, field surgeons irrigating wounds, apothecaries rejecting suspicious wines. He never intervened again unless called. But he watched. He watched the slow adoption of his methods. He watched poison lose its inevitability. He watched relief spread. And he understood that knowledge distributed is cruelty diminished. The name, the silver tongue, persisted long after his body yielded to slow decline, even when his liver weakened so that his handwriting trembled. Even when coughing seized him across winter nights, he continued to record, to taste, to advise. He trained a few trusted healers under hooded midnight conditions. Young apprentices who could decode his botanical cipher, recognize his flavor threshold glyphs, replicate his charcoal mix. They became silent carriers of his code. But Kale never claimed them. He remained legend, not mentor. His secrecy preserved his safety. His anonymity preserved his efficacy. At the end, they found no tomb, no gravestone, no final ledger entry marking his passing. He vanished like a tincture dissolved into water. In some distant city, one of his apprentices found his final notes tucked into a journal he left behind. Dosage refinements, expanded antidote charts, regional herbal substitutes, encoded gratitude to unnamed recipients. His handwriting still steady on doctored parchment, his codes legible, his presence felt. And then no more pages. The pages ended. No name, no farewell, only silence. But across countless towns and villages, families survived arsenic contamination once deadly. Nobles escaped poisoning at banquets. Soldiers recovered from compound caustic wounds. Children recovered from mercury water taint. The recipes shared, the glyphs replicated, the whispered protocols preserved. They saved lives. They prevented death. They built small, quiet resistance to Varen's legacy of testing and destruction. Kale, the silver tongue, the anonymous antidote maker, had become far more than a legend. He had become a living network of survival. His escape had been the act, his wanderings a legacy, his silence a shield. And in the end, though he never sought praise and though he never spoke of Varen again, his work endured where cruelty had sought only to erase. In the low hum of kitchens, in the hush of battlefield tents, and in the quiet of herbal apothecaries, the antidote maker lived on not by body, but by method, not by fate, but by remedy, not by sound, but by silence. And so history remembers not his face, not his voice, but his impact. The man who could taste death and offer life in return, the wandering healer called a silver tongue. When Kale finally stopped wandering, when the worn leather straps of his satchel cracked and the ink in his travel journal began to fade from years of repetitive exposure to damp and heat, he found himself on the edge of a minor trade village whose name rarely appeared on maps, nestled between moss-caked hills and silent, pale riverbanks. It was here, far from the halls of noble alchemists and the shadowed basements of experimentation, that he rented an abandoned stone building, once a grain storehouse, now emptied of rodents and dust, an open and narrow, unassuming apothecary with no sign and no heraldry. There was no official notice, no town crier announcement, no affiliation with any guild or trade registry. Word of his presence spread quietly, as was his preference, whispered between market vendors and mothers of sick children. And when villagers entered, they found not a physician's formal robes, not a scholar's ink-stained parchment desk, but narrow, dimly lit workspace surrounded by small wooden drawers, faded herb bundles, and a single long shelf, upon which rested the black journal, wrapped in wax cloth and sealed with twine. It never left the shelf during hours of public service, but remained visible like a threat or a monument, or perhaps both. Cale accepted no apprentices from trade families. He refused noble patronage, turned away petitioners with recommendations or credentials. Instead, he took in only orphans, children with nowhere to go, who bore the same marks of early abandonment and hardened resourcefulness that he once carried. Some were found curled behind the butcher's stalls, some sweeping for crumbs near the mill, some covered in soot from collapsed chimneys. He offered them no promises of comfort. He told them plainly, there would be no testing of human compounds, no trials, no swallowing of tinctures without full knowledge. He told them he would teach them how to detect poison, not how to produce it. He would teach them how to prevent death, not cause it. He would not allow a single body to fall under his watch again. This was a place of learning and restraint, not ambition. The children, perhaps sensing the gravity of his tone, rarely spoke in return. They worked in silence, organizing dried roots, cleaning glass vials, memorizing the names and properties of herbs. Their days were filled with categorization, bitter, acrid, cooling, burning, binding, loosening. Every leaf had a weight, every root a preparation time, every resin a boiling threshold. They learned first to observe, then to document, then very slowly to replicate but never ingest. The black journal, long hidden from the eyes of others, became a tool, not a myth or leverage, but of pedagogy. He placed it on the central desk once each week, unwrapping its pages only under candlelight, only when the orphans sat with clean hands and prepared minds. Cale read from it with a tone not of pride, but of warning. Entry 37, he would say, tapping a smeared line, records the symptoms of a toxin combination, iron root extract with binding gum. The assistant noted dizziness, slowed heartbeat, discoloration in the gums. He would pause. That assistant was me. I lost feeling in my right foot for 6 days. Varen called it a calculated success. The children wrote these entries down in simple ciphers of their own. They did not speak during the readings. Many entries ended in silence. Some pages were left unfinished. Others contained red ink where Cale had revisited the memory, correcting Varen's language, replacing terms like viable outcome with irreversible harm. He encouraged the children to ask not how it worked, but why it was done. Was it necessary? He would ask. Could it have been tested on parchment first? Could a mouse have sufficed? Over time, the children's annotations became more reflective, more ethical. The journal evolved into a cautionary scripture, sacred not for its genius, but for the suffering it recorded. As the apothecary stabilized, Cale began the slow, grueling task of writing his own work, a formal treatise, not for the orphans, not for wandering herbalists, but for the alchemical community at large. He titled it The Limits of Alchemy, a deliberate and provocative phrase. The manuscript grew slowly, penned with disciplined precision in his spidery hand, its pages always bordered by notations and small glyphs of caution. He did not rail against alchemy itself. He never denied its power or its possibilities, but he dissected its dangers with methodical clarity. He wrote of the false assumption of human expendability. He documented case studies in which experimentation led to irreversible harm when alternatives were available. He cited specific compounds, their effect thresholds, their potential side effects, always alongside a moral note. The presence of effectiveness does not negate the cost of application. He wrote on page 92, an antidote derived through suffering is a remedy built upon a corpse. It is medicine wrapped in guilt. He categorized alchemists not by title but by behavior, those who sought knowledge or protection, and those who pursued it for dominance. He dissected Varen's methods in clinical detail, naming him only once at the outset before referring to him thereafter as the architect. He analyzed the structural patterns of Varen's experiments, the tendency to escalate toxicity with each failure, the reliance on expendable bodies, the rewriting of records to suit outcomes. Cale warned against the temptation to trust results without understanding their origin. He wrote entire sections on alternative testing, Methods of simulation using animal tissue, botanical parallels, metal reactions, chemical transference charts. He included appendices filled with ethical testing frameworks, suggested odes for students, even meditative exercises to remind alchemists of their purpose: to preserve, not dominate. The treatise read not like a manifesto but a slow, heavy counterweight, meant not to provoke but to anchor. He refused to publish it while he lived. He feared retribution, feared revival of his past, feared the political backlash from guilds who profited off experimental bravado. Instead, he copied it in triplicate, storing one in his apothecary's hidden drawer, one in a sealed crate buried beneath the herb garden, and one wrapped in oilcloth and entrusted to a former apprentice who had moved to a distant city. "If I am ever taken," he said, "publish this where it cannot be silenced." The apprentice, whose name is lost history, reportedly honored that request. As the years passed, Cale aged in visible ways. His hands trembled more often, his breath shortened on steep stairs, his taste dwindled to near absence. But his mind, preserved by constant writing and correction, remained clear. His students, now in their teens, administered the apothecary more and more. They diagnosed common illnesses, brewed safe tinctures, identified signs of poisoning from water or spoiled grain. But none crossed the line into human testing. Cale reminded them weekly, if the cost of discovery is your own blood, weigh it twice. If it is another's, weigh it tenfold. Toward the final months of his life, he wrote a single final chapter to the Black Journal, not in red ink but in gray, thinner script. The journal began as a ledger of cruelty. It ends now as a record of restraint. He detailed the changes he had made. No forced testing, no deaths, no experiments without full understanding. He concluded the entry with one line underlined 3 times. Knowledge is not an excuse for harm. When he died peacefully, alone in his chair with a cup of cool tea and a half-edited manuscript, his students found a treatise, the final journal entry, and the 3 glyphs burned into his desk. One symbol for poison, one for knowledge, and one for choice. They preserved the apothecary for years after, renaming it nothing, leaving the signpost blank. People called it the Quiet Shop. And while no statue or painting of Cale was ever commissioned, his legacy lived through every healer who chose caution over ambition, who read symptoms rather than sought glory, who passed knowledge down not through trials, but through teachings. And so in history's quiet ledger, Cale the Poison Tester became something else entirely, not a martyr, not a hero, but a reminder that even in the depths of cruelty, one might build a life of quiet resistance, grounded not in power, but in principle. Cale's final days were as uneventful as the surface of still pond water and just as silent. In a small wooden house, slightly slanted from years of root growth and poor carpentry, located on the edge of a forgotten forest, whose name had changed too many times to be of archival significance, the man who had once been known as a human instrument of risk, cruelty, survival, and stubborn resistance, gradually succumbed to lung failure over the course of several days. There was no doctor in attendance, nor any priest to deliver comfort or rites. His breaths became shallower each morning, the wheezing more prominent in the evening, until one morning, unremarkable in weather or omen, his students found in his chair, facing the trillion, a cup of cold decoction still resting on the table beside a half-annotated page of his manuscript. The fire had long gone out. The tea had long grown bitter. His eyes were closed, and there was no sign of pain or distress on his face. Just the weight of a man who had lived too long in the company of things meant to kill. The students, trained in stoicism and reflection, did not cry. They cleaned the small home, folded his few remaining garments, wrapped his body in coarse linen, and buried him beneath the stone marker in the herb garden, between patches of feverfew and bloodwort, facing north. There was no epitaph, only a simple carving. See, they understood the value of anonymity. Names drew attention. Attention drew questions. Questions sometimes reopened histories meant to be buried. Shortly after his death, news of his treatise began to circulate, not through formal channels, but through whispered copies and unmarked packages sent between progressive herbalists, independent scholars, and underground medical academies. The limits of alchemy, once housed in triplicate and sealed for emergencies, became an object of quiet rebellion. Its first public appearance occurred not in a recognized journal, but as part of a footnote in a banned pamphlet distributed in the southern districts of an unnamed coastal city. Its ideas, chiefly the ethical ceiling of experimentation and the rejection of human expendability, were immediately condemned by official alchemical guilds. The high practicum of inner tinctures declared the work dangerous, inflammatory, and contrary to the sacred freedom of alchemical pursuit. The Eastern Table of Advancement decreed all known copies destroyed. Any practitioner found quoting from it was to be disbarred. One senior professor, after anonymously publishing a paper inspired by Cale's chapter on non-invasive testing using botanical analogs, was dismissed without trial and lost his license to practice across 5 provinces. And yet, the treatise did not disappear. Despite its ban, it continued to circulate in secret, hand-copied with care in basements, attic rooms, and traveling wagons. Its dense prose, filled with meticulous compound breakdowns and side effect annotations, was slowly read aloud by candlelight to new generations of medical dissenters. They read the phrases like scripture. The presence of healing does not excuse the path of harm, and where knowledge requires a life, reconsider the worth of the knowledge. Phrases Cale had once scribbled in frustration, not expecting they would survive the death of his body, let alone the extinction of his name from public discourse. The more the treatise was suppressed, the more carefully it was preserved. It became, over time, a whisper of resistance within the alchemical community, a ghost text used to justify caution, a citation spoken in code. For nearly a century, Cale's name was absent from formal documents. His journal, where it existed, was renamed or uncredited entirely. But in every copy, usually on the inner cover or final page, readers would find a single symbol, 3 overlapping circles, representing poison, knowledge, and choice. The glyph Cale had burned into his work table and which had, against all odds, become a symbol for ethical restraint. A full 100 years after Cale's quiet death and unacknowledged burial, the winds of the alchemical world began to shift. A new generation of scholars, many of them born after the wars that devastated large sectors of rural communities due to experimental weaponized compounds, began to call for a re-evaluation of foundational doctrines. Reports of test subject casualties, long suppressed, were leaking into public record. A scholar named Elin Dervain, herself a descendant of a field healer who once trained under Cale, petitioned the Grand Institute of Toxicology to reconsider the historical classification of early poison testers. She presented copies of the limits of alchemy, tracing its handwritten lineage across 72 known iterations. In her speech, which has since been printed in full and taught at the Institute's Ethics Hall, she described Cale as the unknown sentinel, a figure who had endured not to glorify suffering, but to prevent it from continuing unchecked. It took 3 more decades of archival debate, heated council sessions, and anonymous funding from reformist factions before the Institute agreed to acknowledge Cale's contribution. The statue was carved in muted gray stone, intentionally unadorned, neither heroic nor tragic. It was placed not in the central hall but in the garden courtyard, between 2 granite benches, among a collection of medicinal plants. Cale is depicted seated, writing on a tablet, his eyes downward, his face unreadable. A closed book rests beside him. Beneath the statue, the inscription is simple: CEO, poison tester. Historian, healer. Warning: no further information is given. The statue is not a monument in the traditional sense. It invites no reverence. Instead, it serves as a meditation, a reminder that the knowledge which heals can be born of deep and terrible costs, and that it is the responsibility of each generation not only to advance, but to remember what price was once paid for the path they now walk. Today, the limit of alchemy is read aloud annually at the Institute's Winter Assembly, each chapter voiced by a different student. The Black Journal, or what remains of it, resides in a glass case within the lower archives, still bound in wax cloth. Visitors are instructed to handle it only with gloves. Some pages remain unreadable. Others are stained with unidentifiable blotches. It is not considered a masterpiece of writing. Its prose is uneven, its notes emotionally charged, its structure inconsistent. And yet, it is preserved not because of literary merit, but because of the moral framework it dares to assert. That survival without humanity is not survival worth continuing. That knowledge acquired through disregard corrodes the very society it seeks to serve. Cale's house, overgrown with vines and long abandoned, collapsed during a heavy storm some 40 years after his death. Nothing remains of the structure itself. The herb garden, however, still yields growth each spring. No official marker designates it as a site of interest. Local children play nearby. A few field medics still collect samples of feverfew from its northern corner. And so, without force, without fame, without a parade or proclamation, Cale's legacy endures in the manner he would have wanted. Quietly, anonymously, and just enough to protect those who might otherwise be forgotten. Cale was never hailed as a hero, not in his time, nor in the decades that immediately followed his quiet death. There were no celebrations of his contributions, no songs composed in his honor, and no scrolls officially sealed with his name in ink. He was not praised in courtrooms nor cited in the annals of recognized alchemical advancement. His name appeared only in whispers, scribbled footnotes, and at times on documents that were later burned or hidden away in locked drawers by scholars who feared being associated with what the era deemed subversive ideology. Indeed, Cale was not considered a symbol of progress by his contemporaries. If anything, he was viewed by the mainstream alchemical establishment as an irritant, a disruptive presence, an individual whose views bordered on treason against the unspoken consensus that human experimentation, however unfortunate, was a necessary evil in the pursuit of scientific truth. And yet, with the steady passage of time and the slow shifting of public values, his life came to represent a quiet turning point. Not in explosive revelations or landmark discoveries, but in the way alchemy, toxicology, and experimental medicine began to re-express their relationship to human life, dignity, and pain. Cale did not invent a new compound that prolonged life by decades, nor did he uncover a singular cure that ended plagues or reversed terminal afflictions. His work was incremental, observational, and morally grounded, a catalog of failures, mistakes, and insights gained through his own suffering. But within the steady rhythm of his entries, the fragments of his formulas, and the ethical annotations left scrawled in the margins of the Black Journal, a new idea began to take shape. The concept that discovery and cruelty need not walk hand in hand, that it was, in fact, possible to separate the two. That pain was not the price of knowledge, only the shortcut. That better methods, longer but more humane, could still lead to understanding, without reducing the human body to a disposable instrument in someone else's pursuit of glory. His journey, which began in the most unremarkable of ways, as a malnourished orphan in the shadow of an alchemical dumping ground, was marked not by ambition but by necessity. From the moment he entered Varen's laboratory, sweeping floors among fumes and rot, his life was a negotiation between survival and submission. He did not seek greatness. He sought only to avoid death, first in the streets, then in the lab, then in the slow disintegration of his body under the weight of countless toxins. But it was in those grim rituals, in swallowing the unknown, in trembling beside beakers and scribes, that he came to understand the most dangerous truth of all, that power, when unchallenged, becomes blind to consequence. That knowledge, when untethered from conscience, will always demand a sacrifice, and that those sacrifices, so often called necessary, are rarely borne by those who make the decisions. Cale questioned power not loudly, not with the bravado of revolutionaries or the polish of philosophers, but with the weariness of someone who had seen too much too young. He asked his questions in brief, deliberate ways, in the margins of experiment logs, in notes to his peers, in the trembling refusal to drink yet another compound that might strip him of his memories, his sight, or his final shreds of dignity. He challenged authority by surviving it, and that, in itself, was an act of rebellion. Varen, cruel in intent and obsessive in purpose, viewed Cale not as a boy or even a man, but as a measuring instrument, a thing to absorb results, register reactions, and then be stored again for the next trial. But Cale's resistance, always quiet, often invisible, was consistent. His refusal to die, to forget, or to allow his suffering to be erased without documentation, became his legacy. When Cale escaped, with little more than a Black Journal and a manuscript half-written, he did not become a revolutionary. He did not storm the halls of power or attempt to dismantle the guild from within. Instead, he walked from one village to the next. He treated poisonings, diagnosed afflictions, and healed what he could. He earned little. He asked for less. Those who met him remembered his pale eyes, his tired voice, the way he tasted broth with the same care as he read symptoms. Some called him the silver tongue. Others, simply the old man with the bitter herbs. He never spoke his past unless asked directly, and even then his answers were clipped. "I used to work for a man who taught me what not to do," he once said, when asked why he tested nothing on others. "That's enough of a curriculum for one life." His apothecary, built with cracked wood and hand-ground mortar, was never more than 3 rooms wide. But inside those rooms, something unprecedented happened. Knowledge was passed on without coercion. Ethics were not an afterthought, but a framework. The orphans he took in were not swept into servitude or silent compliance, but invited to question, to reflect, to consider the weight of every mixture before it touched another's lips. Kale forbade human testing. He banned secrecy in formulas. And most critically, he required that every experiment begin with a moral assessment. Not what will this do, but who might it harm? It was, by contemporary standards, an inefficient and unnecessarily cautious method. But his students remembered it, practiced it, and spread it slowly against resistance across the medical underground. His journal, the infamous Black Journal, became more than just a log of symptoms and results. It was used as a teaching tool, not for what to do, but what never to repeat. The scrawled notes beside fatal reactions, the crossed-out procedures, the brief entries describing days when Kale could no longer feel his tongue or remember the names of colors. These became the ethical spine of a movement that believed knowledge must not be born from the disposable bodies of the powerless. When asked why he kept the journal, when it clearly brought back pain, Kale would simply say, "So no one else forgets. If you erase pain, you repeat it." Over time, his treatise, The Limits of Alchemy, found its way into the hands of reformers and skeptics. Though banned by most guilds, it was preserved in fragments, copied and recopied, annotated by hand. It did not preach revolution. It preached caution. It did not glorify suffering. It condemned it. Most of all, it warned that in the pursuit of knowledge, it is easy to forget the faces of those sacrificed along the way. And when those faces are forgotten, the pursuit becomes poison. The treatise, like its author, was understated, but its impact slowly rippled through the next century of practice. Kale, the boy in rags, the reluctant tester, the man with a dying liver and numb hands, became posthumously a symbol of restraint, not because he was a genius, not because he was a martyr, but because he survived and chose to remember what others would have buried. To this day, his name is spoken not in grand halls or banquet ceremonies, but in quiet classrooms, whispered between new students who feel discomfort at the cold detachment of certain procedures. His statue, where it exists, is simple, seated contemplative, holding no beaker, issuing no commands. He looks not at the sky, but at the ground, as if to remind those who pass by that knowledge, like roots, grows from below, and that what lies beneath, the pain, the cost, the ethics, must not be ignored. And so we return to the idea that knowledge without conscience is poison, a phrase now engraved on the gates of a few modern institutions, though it was once mocked as naive, idealistic, and unnecessary. Kale lived by that principle long before it was recognized and paid dearly for it. His was not a life of triumph, but of endurance, not of accolades, but of warnings. And in the end, that warning remains. A final question lingers, perhaps the most important of all. Would you drink the poison if it meant no one else had to? Kale did, not because he was brave, not because he was special, but because he believed someone had to, that someone had to say no when everyone else said yes, that someone had to remember what pain really was. And in doing so, he made sure the world could choose a better way forward. Sleep now with that thought, not of heroes, but of witnesses, not of glory, but of memory, not of fire discovery, but the cold responsibility it leaves behind. Let the poison pass you by. For Kale already drank it. Once again, if you like this video, don't forget to like and subscribe so we have more motivation to produce better quality products. And now, good night.